Greetings everyone, Melderon here, and welcome to the TBC Classic Advanced Shaman Guide, Part 1. This is a guide I've been working on for a very long time, probably about 100 plus hours of research involved in this guide, and my primary goal here is to teach people who are new to TBC or new to Shaman in general about the class, the deeper parts of the class, and how you can be the best Shaman possible. That's the goal of this guide. Now, I did most of the legwork, but I want to put special thanks to the Classic Shaman Discord, primarily Egregious and Hitbutton. Thank you so much for the correspondence. And the Elitist Jerks, if you're out there still listening, thank you so much for the Theorycraft you did in original TBC to corroborate the things I found on my own private testing environment, which is based on a 2.4.3 private server called Mangoes. Before we get started, a little housekeeping. As with all of my guides, there'll be a pinned comment below with all the timestamps so you can navigate this guide quickly and efficiently, and I will use YouTube annotations to break up the guide so you can go to parts of the guide you want to revisit or you're really primarily interested in. Now, this will be a long one. It's about 111 slides, so there's a lot to go over. There's a lot of new things in TBC and a lot of exciting things for Shaman in TBC. So buckle up, let's get started. First, before we get into the guide proper, I want to talk about the Classic Shaman Discord, which I'm part of. I'm the co-founder of, along with Egregious. It's a multidisciplinary collaborative home for all things Classic Shaman. And a lot of this guide came from personal correspondence with people that I know in that Discord. And we cover both Vanilla Classic and TBC Classic. We have over 18,000 members. We have experienced and professional moderators and Shaman trainers ready to answer any of the questions that you have. And we have very deep discussion on spec-specific strategy, theorycraft, leveling, play improvements, anything you can think of. And the best part is you can bother me whenever you want. There'll be a link to that Classic Shaman Discord in the description below, and if you're going to play Shaman in any capacity in TBC, I highly recommend joining the Discord today. Once you join, you'll be able to see the README channel, and all you have to do is react to the expansion that you want to be a part of, and the Discord will open those parts of the Discord. So you can click on Classic Vanilla, Classic TBC, or even Wrath of the Lich King, which is still under development, so there's nothing really there. But obviously, if you're watching this guide, you're interested in TBC, so definitely at least click that emoji, and then the TBC specific portion of Discord will open to you, so you can then converse with people that have similar interests as you. Before I proceed to give you what you need, I want to talk about the foundations of this work. This is technically a new part in a series of videos on classic WoW era Shaman. I have guides on totems, on advanced Shaman mechanics from vanilla, leveling from vanilla, and this all builds up from those things. So if you feel like I'm going too fast, or you feel like there's like, wait a second, I don't even know what he's talking about here, it's probably because you haven't watched some of my older videos, because I'm building upon the theory that I've talked about in those videos, and it requires a knowledge of classic Shaman. There are things that if you're just new to Shaman and TBC in general, you'll pick up from this guide, but I feel like you're going to be left in the dust when it comes to some of the more advanced topics. So I would watch those videos first. So think of these as prerequisite courses for the course you're taking now. Links are available in the description. The actual entire Melderon Shaman guide playlist will be down there. So it has all of the Shaman guides that I've made prior to this one. I like to outline the purpose of this guide, and this guide is not tailored as a general PvE guide. I won't be going over things like enchants, gemming, talents, totem loadouts, pre-raid bis. Honestly, those things are ubiquitous on the internet. You can find them anywhere. I am in the process of making those guides with some of the experts that I've known from the Discord, so there will be specific PvE guides for each spec, and there already is a restoration one I did with Egregious. That was done last week. That's in the description. If you want to know more about Resto Shaman, it's a great guide, and Egregious really knows his stuff, so I would definitely check that out. Instead, this guide's goal is to make you a more well-informed Shaman, looking at the big picture, making big picture decisions, and understand your class at a much deeper level, hence the word advanced. That's why I call this an advanced Shaman guide. Think of it as a graduate level course in Shaman, if you will. The Theorycraft I'll be going over in this guide is built mostly for endgame PvE. However, you will learn information that will be helpful in PvP, leveling, farming, any aspect of the game you can think of. The reason why it's more PvE centric is because PvE is where Theorycraft comes from. Sure, there's strategy for Arena, but that strategy comes from first Theorycraft that's known about the abilities and the mechanics of each class. So it's not PvE by design, it's just PvE because it's a Theorycraft guide. That's essentially why. I hope you enjoy the guide, and if you have any questions, of course, hit me up in the Classic Shaman Discord. One more introduction slide, I promise. I just want to go over a disclaimer. So this guide has been built using Theorycraft and data from actual TBC, 2007-2008. Most of the topics covered have been verified by multiple sources, including the famous guild Elitist Jerks. Links to their Shaman pages are in the description of the video. Because of these facts, I am highly confident of the validity of the data, and have spent over 100 hours researching and testing what is presented. Now, specifically concerning spell coefficients and weapon imbues. The testings of spell coefficients and weapon imbues I present here were done using a 2.4.3 TBC repack, which is not an official Blizzard product. Despite this, almost all spell coefficients and weapon imbue results that I've gathered corroborates what has been actually tested by multiple TBC era Theorycrafters. However, until an official pre-patch, beta and or live TBC game has been released, I cannot be 100% sure the spell coefficients and weapon imbue results are completely correct. As soon as I get access to an official client, I will upload a new video with my findings, which will be called TBC Classic Advanced Shaman Guide Part 2. And that video's purpose will be to retest anything I've tested in this guide and just make sure it works out. And to make you feel a little bit better, when I did Advanced Shaman Guide Part 2 for Classic, the spell coefficients were nearly identical, and so were the weapon imbue tests. So I'm highly confident that this guide will be very well suited for TBC when it comes out. Alright, table of contents. What are we going to be going over in this guide? A lot. Inherent class changes, stat offerings, race and faction choice, new random enchantment gear, new spells, talents, changes to old spells and talents, spell coefficients and downranking, spec discussion and theorycraft. Those are going to be the two largest sections. Shaman raid impact and strategy, leveling strategy, whether to pick the Aldors or the Scryers depending on your spec, and finally UI and add-ons. Let's start with inherent class changes. There are a number of changes that happen to the Shaman class in TBC. The first is the internal Wind Fury weapon cooldown. So I probably have heard of this. It's called the Wind Fury ICD, and it's 3 seconds. What this means is you cannot proc Wind Fury for 3 seconds after a proc has happened. Doesn't matter whether you're dual wielding, whether you're using a two-hander, you can't proc Wind Fury twice or more than once in a 3-second window. So once that first Wind Fury hits, a 3-second internal cooldown will start, and you cannot proc Wind Fury until that cooldown's over. And this cannot be circumvented by using multiple Wind Fury imbue ranks. That used to be the case back in early TBC. You could put Wind Fury rank 4 on one, Wind Fury rank 3 on the other, and you would actually get it to circumvent this ICD. Blizzard noticed this pretty quickly and fixed it. Now, what's interesting is there is no internal cooldown for Wind Fury Totem. Now remember, Wind Fury Totem only provides 1 extra attack, less bonus attack power, and there is no ICD for that. Let's say there's a arms warrior in your group using a 2.2 second axe. It's very possible for him to get 2 Wind Fury procs back to back. That cannot happen if you use the weapon enhancement. And no, using the totem is not going to increase your DPS, trust me. The 2 extra attacks with the bonus power, even if it's capped at 3 seconds, is still more DPS than if you're getting it from the totem. Dual wielding is the far superior option for PvE endgame DPS. Just make sure your main hand is very slow, and if you're going to be doing double Wind Fury imbues, we'll get into what that means, but make sure both your weapons are slow. There's no way around this. It's just a change they made. It's the cap, probably potential DPS, and weird chaining that can happen with 2 weapons. It kind of sucks, but trust me, Wind Fury still feels good. Now we have a new race and faction, the Draenei, which is Alliance only, so now Shaman are not Horde specific anymore. The Alliance have Shaman as well, and you can be a Shaman on the Alliance if you are a Draenei. And we'll go over what that means and the benefits of being a Draenei in TBC. The Totem GCD has been reduced from 1.5 seconds to 1 second, which is great, and you'll notice it right away. You can put 4 totems down much faster. It feels great. It's very fluid. Honestly, that was needed. It took way too long to get totems down as a Shaman in Vanilla Classic, and if you are a healer or a DPS, you feel like you've lost a significant part of that DPS window or healing opportunities because of totems. Another interesting thing, and if you have the standard UI, is totems go underneath your character portrait, and you can actually right-click and cancel the totem. There is no mana refund if you use this, so I wouldn't do this, but just it's kind of cool that they integrated totems into the base UI. There are a lot of stat changes. I won't go over that in this slide. We'll go over it in another slide. It's mostly new stats, not so much changes to stats that we already had access to. You Shaman tanks out there, I'm not saying it's impossible to Shaman tank, but tanking has been somewhat reduced, and we'll go over why that is. It's basically the possible threat per second you can produce as a Shaman has been nerfed. We'll get into why in a later slide. Weapon buffs have been extended to 30 minutes. Should I say that again? Weapon buffs have been extended to 30 minutes. This is huge. As you know, if you played Shaman in Classic, re-enchanting your weapon every 5 minutes was a pain in the ass. Considering if you're Enhancement Shaman, it's literally a wasted GCD during a boss encounter, or during whatever. That's been extended to 30 minutes, which is a huge quality of life improvement for Shaman in my opinion. Two-handed maces and axes are now learned from Weapon Masters, so you no longer have a talent and enhancement to learn these. So, yes, all Shaman have access to two-handed weapons, which is pretty interesting. New spells and or ranks are available every level from 61 to 70. So in Classic, it was every 2 levels. In TBC, it's every level. So make sure you go to your class trainer every time you ding to get new ranks or new spells in Outland. Now let's go over our basic stat sheet. Any good RPG game has a basic stat sheet, right? None of these really change much. 1 stamina equals 10 hit points, just like it did in Classic. 1 strength is 2 attack power. Also, strength increases the amount of damage you block with a shield by 1 per 23 strength at level 60 and per 21.4 strength at level 70. Won't be using a shield very much unless you're Shaman tanking, so this isn't really something to worry about. Agility. You gain 1% melee crit and 1% dodge with every 20 agility at level 60. That's been bumped up to 25 agility at level 70, so you need a little bit more agility to get that 1% 1% melee crit and 1% dodge. It also increases armor by 2 per 1 agility regardless of level, so that hasn't changed. Spirit increases our out-of-combat health regen by 1 health per second per 8.6 Spirit at level 60 and 9.46 Spirit at level 70. And it also increases out-of-combat and in-combat mana regen by 1 mana per 5 seconds per 1.06 Spirit at level 60 and 1.58 Spirit at level 70. In order for you to gain mana inside of combat, you have to be outside of the 5-second rule, meaning you have not casted a single spell for 5 seconds. This is not a huge stat for Shaman in any regard. 1 intellect equals 15 mana, just as it did in Classic, and if you have 5 out of 5 ancestral knowledge, 1 intellect is worth 15.75 mana. A little boost to that. Intellect also increases spell critical strike chance at a rate of 1% per 30 at level 60 and 41.1 intellect at level 70. Now this is a stat that's contended. We originally thought that the Shaman rate was much higher for intellect to spell crit, 60.5 at level 60 to be exact. Once we went back and tested that in actual vanilla, we realized it's actually closer to Paladins. Paladins are 25 intellect per crit, and Shaman are actually only 30, so we actually get more crit per intellect than most classes in the game. Now assuming that trend's going to continue in TBC, we should only need 41.1 intellect to level 70. But this has to be tested, and I'll make sure I test this when the Classic WoW beta comes out. Intellect also gives healing and spell power at a rate of 0.3 per point, with 3 out of 3 Nature's Blessing. However, you have to be Restoration to have this talent. So Intellect gives more for Restoration Shamans, which is nice. 30% of your Intellect is a big boost to your healing and spell power. Alright, now let's go over the advanced and new stats. There's a lot to cover here. Essentially, some new stats were added, and then older stats were shifted and changed, like Critical Strike, and we'll get into that in a second. So let's start with Haste. So Haste is a new stat. The same rules apply for Spell and Melee, whereas 10 Haste rating, that's how you'll see it on gear, will increase your Haste by 1% at level 60, and then 15.8 Haste rating will increase it by 1% at level 70. Haste decreases the time between attacks and spells by affecting the GCD and or the cast time. Example, if you have 1% haste, in the time it would take you to normally cast 100 spells, you can now cast 99 spells. So that's how you should think about haste. As far as melee is concerned, it reduces the GCD so you can attack more often. Now for expertise rating, another new stat, this was converted from weapon skill around patch 2.3. So weapon skill, as far as endgame is concerned, is not a stat you'll be worried about. Weapon skill still exists, but we'll get into how this works. So expertise rating, 3.9423, large decimal, expertise rating equals 1 expertise, and 1 expertise is a 0.25% reduction in chance that a mob will dodge or parry your attack. This is only really important for enhancement. 103 expertise rating, or 26.12 expertise, is the expertise cap, 6.25% dodge reduction. Now, if for some reason boss dodge is lower, 5.6%, it'll be 91 expertise rating, or 23 expertise to reach that cap. 6.25% is the highest observed dodge. However, almost all mobs have a 5.6% chance of dodge, including bosses. Again, 6.25 is the actual cap, but that won't apply to all bosses, so you could shift around gear depending on the boss once we know more about which bosses have which dodge ratings to use the right set so you can increase your DPS stats. Now, expertise does increase your DPS, but if the boss only has 5.6% dodge, anything over that is waste. So you can perhaps put different stats like crit or haste. So weapon skill rating. If we use a patch before 2.3, which I don't think we will, I think TBC will be 2.4.3, 2.5 weapon skill rating equals 1 weapon skill at level 60, 3.9 weapon skill rating will equal 1 weapon skill level 70. Again, this likely won't be the case, but just in case it is, now you know. Hit rating. Hit has been changed to hit rating. So 10 hit rating at level 60 is 1% hit, but it's 15.8 at level 70 to get 1% hit. Now, hit cap for special attacks and white attacks using a one-hander and shield or a two-hander is 9%. It's the same thing from Classic. If you remember, there's a dual-wielding penalty when it comes to hit. So if you're using a one-hander and shield or a two-hander, your hit's only 9% for PvE and 5% for PvP. Again, Enhancement Shamans, this is something to do with you, but you'll be dual-wielding most of the time. For dual-wielding, cap is 28%, 442.4 hit rating. As in Classic, that's a very hard cap to reach. So your most important cap is that first 9% to your yellow attacks or special attacks like Storm Strike will hit all the time. But anything past that cap will still help you and will still increase DPS because you will miss less. Spell hit rating, slightly different. Same concept though. 8 spell hit rating equals 1% hit at level 60. 12.6 spell hit rating will equal 1% hit at level 70 for spells. Now the hit cap for casters is 16%. Same thing as it was in Classic WoW, which is 201.6 hit rating. That's your cap. Now the PvP spell hit cap is 3%. The asterisk on hit cap is there because if you know from Classic, you will always have a 1% chance to miss or be resisted, is what it's called in spellcasting. You don't see miss, you see resist. That cannot be mitigated. So your spells if you're hit capped, will hit 99% of the time. If you still see resists, that's because of that 1% chance. You know, it doesn't happen often, but just so you know. Critical strike rating, so crit has been transferred to critical strike rating, and this is the same for spells and melee. 14 critical strike rating equals 1% crit level 60, and 22.1 crit rating will equal 1% crit at level 70. Finally, we have resilience. So resilience is really a PvP stat. However, it does come into play with tanking. Not something you'll worry about much as a shaman unless you are shaman tanking, which will be, you know, rare, obviously. But for PvP, 39.4 resilience equals a 1% less chance to be critically struck and 2% less damage from critical strikes. So if you have that much resilience, you'll be crit 1% less often, and the damage from a crit will do 2% less damage. I hope that makes sense. It's pretty clear. The more resilience you have, the less damage you'll take in PvP, and the less damage you'll take as a tank. But resilience doesn't really come on tank gear. Now, I know expertise was a little confusing, so I'm going to go over that one more time. As you know, human and orc racials in Classic WoW gave weapon skill rating. Since weapon skill most likely won't be in the game because we'll be in a 2.4.3 environment, the orc and human racials now give 5 expertise rating. Okay, what does that mean? So an easy way to understand that is the 5 expertise from racials leads to 2.5% more yellow and white connects if you're attacking from the front, so that doesn't really apply to Enhancement Shaman, but 1.25% more yellow and white attacks connect if you're from the rear, which you'll be attacking from as a DPS. Remember, if you're attacking from the rear, the mob can't parry or block you. So you always want to attack from the rear because you're removing 2 possible outcomes from the hit table roll. So you want to do that 100% of the time. So that 5 expertise rating is basically a 1.25% increase in DPS. Now, these aren't as impactful as they were in Classic because they don't affect glancing penalties. It's still good, it's just not as good as it was in Classic. And because of that, Orc Enhancement Shaman will be the superior pick for min-maxing DPS. But wait, there's even more stats to go over. Armor penetration is another new stat introduced in TBC. Now, this stat ignores a percentage of the armor of your opponent. It's actually the amount of armor advertised in your armor penetration. Now, this provides a personal buff. This is not raid-wide, it's not like Sunder armor, that has increasing returns, not diminishing returns. So the more armor penetration you have, the more damage increase you'll get. The equation used to calculate armor penetration is the boss armor divided by boss armor minus this number, 22167.5 plus 467.5 times your level, which is 70 for these examples. So if a boss has 2000 armor, that boss has 15.9 physical damage reduction. If you have 200 armor penetration, you remove 200 armor, now the armor is 1800, and that's an increase of damage of 1.3% for you. If you have another 200, it's not another 1.3, it's 1.4. So this has increasing returns, not diminishing returns. And armor penetration, the more you have, the more damage you'll do in a scaling way. However, armor penetration is not a really heavily sought after stat, but just know that it exists. It will come on some gear, and that's how it works. Spell penetration is somewhat similar, but it's not generally applicable in PvE, as bosses may have inherent resistances, as they do in Classic, that cannot be mitigated. So spell penetration won't help you there, because elemental resistances were heavily reduced in TBC. You don't have bosses like Ragnaros with fire resistance and stuff like that. But 70 spell penetration is good for PvP. It's actually recommended, as it negates any of the resistances from defensive spells like Mark of the Wild. So you want to have some spell pen in your PvP set. And spell penetration has nothing to do with hit, so forget about that. Spell hit has something to do with hit, so spell penetration will not increase your chance to hit. This isn't a stat, but it's something that you should definitely know as a healer, as a restoration shaman. All healing gear provides approximately 33% of its healing power as chromatic damage, spell power. What I mean by chromatic is non-elemental based, so it's not fire damage or frost damage, it's just spell power. This is great because it allows healers to do some farming in their healing gear, and you can effectively PvP better as a healer if you have some raid gear. And of course, that goes for PvP gear as well. So PvP healing gear will have some spell power, 33% of the healing spell power of that piece. Hope that makes sense, but it basically just helps healers out have some damage, and they're not just totally gimped by having just plus healing. Now let's go over defense skill ratings. These are all the defensive skills that increase your dodge, your parry, your block. Again, not really important for shaman, but just so you know and you're well informed about it. And if your tank asks you, at level 60, a 1.5 defense skill increases your defense skill by 1. 12 dodge rating is 1% dodge. 20 parry is 1 parry. 5 block rating is 1% chance to block. At level 70s are bumped up, as you can see there. I won't read them all off. Again, this isn't really important for you, but just so you know, you have the information to tell your tanks. Now let's talk about glancing blows. Glancing blows still exist in TBC. However, instead of a 40% chance to glance, you now only have a 25% chance to glance. So that's an increase in DPS right there. Pretty nice. This is for level 73 mobs, obviously, bosses. Now that's normalized for all classes, and this was enacted in patch 2.1. Prior to this, glances happened at 40% for melee classes, and 60% for casters that are meleeing, which I don't know why you would do that, but it was much higher for them. Glancing blows do not critically strike, and they cannot occur on special yellow attacks. It's just because because yellow attacks are on a different roll system, and crits are a different outcome than glancing, so they can't happen at the same time. As long as you're at max weapon skill, like I said, weapon skill still does come into play, but it caps at 350. You can't go any higher than that. So once you have that much weapon skill, you have a 0% chance to glance on a mob that's your level or lower, but you have a 25% chance to glance on a mob that's 3 levels higher than you. Unlike weapon skill used to do, expertise doesn't reduce the glancing damage penalty. Remember, in Classic it was a 40% chance to glance for some damage reduction. Now the glancing penalty is between 30 and 40%. The reason why it's 30 to 40% because there's a min-max possible glance penalty, and it's somewhere within that window, and that will happen 25% no matter what. You can't mitigate it. Don't worry about it. It's just every melee class has to deal with that. Your expertise won't affect that at all. Expertise for Enhancement Shaman just reduce the chance that a mob's going to dodge you or parry you technically, but you should be attacking from the front, so parry should not be on the hit table. Now, like I said, weapon skill does still exist, but it's only applicable before level 70. Just make sure it max weapon skill when you enter raids, 350. But once you hit that max weapon skill, your percent hit, percent dodge, or percent parry reaches the natural cap, meaning that's the cap that you'll be in as a level 70 player. You can go above that cap, of course, using expertise, hit, and that'll reduce those effects further. On the right is a melee attack table. If you don't know what this is, there are potential outcomes that the game rolls for when you attempt an attack. You can either miss, you can be dodged, you can be parried, you can glance, you can be blocked, you can critically strike, or you can have a normal hit. The crushing blow is only for mobs hitting players. That's not really important. So on this single roll system, you can only get one outcome at a time, and these are mutually exclusive, and you can remove parry and block from this completely just from attacking from behind, which increases your chance to crit, normal hit, or glance. Those are good things. So that's actually connecting with the mob. Miss can be totally mitigated for yellow attacks, as I said, or white attacks, but that's a really high hit cap. Miss can be removed from this table with plus hit, and dodge can be removed from this table with expertise. So can parry, as I said, but again, you're not attacking from the front. Your goal is to make this system have as least amount of outcomes as possible. You want to have favorable outcomes as much as you possibly can, and that's what stats allow you to do, and that's what attacking behind allows you to do. So by, just like I said, by attacking from behind, you remove 2 possible outcomes from this table, which will increase your DPS. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, again, I'm in the Shaman Discord, but this is a pretty simplistic system. I made a melee mechanics guide for Classic WoW. If you have any questions, I'll put that link in the description below so you can kind of understand melee mechanics a little bit better, but that's out of date, right? TBC is different. We have different stats. Okay, enough about glancing blows. Let's move on to race and faction selection. Race and faction selection to me is really important. It may not seem important to some people, but I really like the Horde, for example. I've always liked the Horde, obviously, because I've been making Shaman guides for vanilla for a very long time, and I really like orcs. I like the lore, I like the way they look, I like their character models, but you gotta think to yourself, why do you want to be a certain race? Is it just because of min-maxing? And that's fine. If that's the person you are, that's great. If you just care about the numbers, wonderful. But if you're like me, it's not all about numbers. I happen to like orcs. They just also have made the best for the DPS roles, in my opinion, but I think they're really cool. So if you want to pick orc, let's talk about your racials. Axe specialization, as we discussed before, increases expertise with axes by 5, which leads to a 1.25% reduction in dodge chance for Enhancement Shaman. Very, very good. Hardiness, chance to resist stun effects by an additional 15%. Used to be 25 in vanilla. Unfortunately, this is going to be removed. It's going to be downsized a little bit. I understand why. It's a pretty powerful racial, but it gets down to 15%, but you still have it. Still very powerful in Arena. Blood Fury increases attack power, as it did in Classic, but it also now increases spell damage, and I'm pretty sure healing. There's a contention there. I have to double check that. For 15 seconds, but also reduces all healing you get by 50% for the same duration. So the attack power buff used to be a certain window, and the heal reduction was longer. Now it's all 15 seconds, which is pretty nice. But obviously, this is good for Elemental and most likely Restoration, unless this is wrong, but it's super good for Enhancement because you get the attack power and you get the spell power, because shocks are a super important part of your rotation, and because of your weapon imbue selection, which we will get into at length later on. You can double dip with this as an orc shaman. Very, very good. For PvE, it makes orc the optimal BIS for enhancement. Absolutely. So before we get to the rundown, I want to talk about Blood Fury, and there's different tooltips afloat around currently, and it's really hard to get confirmation on this. I know for sure it increases attack power and spell power, but I'm not 100% sure it increases healing. It did on my client, but until I get my hands on a beta, I'm not 100% sure if it also increases healing. If it does, great. If it doesn't, I still feel Troll's the best for restoration because of the haste cooldown, but Orc will be a close second because of Blood Fury if that's the case. So the rundown, best for enhancement PvE and general PvP, and likely best for elemental, and second best for restoration in my opinion. Now moving on to Trolls. Relevant racials, Berserking, increases casting and attack speed by 10 to 30% depending on your health. Lower health, the higher haste. This is great for DPS and healing, and it's amazing if you pair with Bloodlust, some super haste coming out out there. This costs 91 mana at level 60 and 177 mana at level 70. They also get Beast Slaying, which increases damage versus beasts by 5%. Generally good for leveling and grinding. Not something I would definitely look for in race selection, but it's a good added bonus. Trolls also have Regeneration, which increases their spirit-based mana regeneration outside of combat by 10%. So a little bit more health regen than normal. But what's interesting is it also allows 10% of that out of combat spirit-based mana regeneration to continue in combat. So you'll gain a little bit of health in combat outside of healing. It's the only race in the game that actually has that. It's a minor amount of health, but it could mean the difference between life and death. Again, it's kind of like endurance in Tauren. It helps sometimes, but it's not a huge deal. Of course, this also happens in PvP, but again, won't save your ass very often. In the rundown with Trolls, I consider them the best for Restoration PvE, so does Egregious because of that Berserking cooldown. And they're a pretty good alternative for Enhancement as well, and Elemental because of that cooldown. And in my opinion, they're kind of average for PvP. Berserking could have its uses in PvP, but I'd much rather have the stun resistance for Orc. Next to the Tauren, War Stomp stuns up to 5 enemies in 8 yards for 2 seconds. I can't tell you how impactful this talent can be. I'm not saying that it's as impactful as stun resistance, but it's definitely impactful in Arena if you're able to get a heal off. It does reset your swing timer, so it kind of sucks for Enhancement. I'm not sure if it's going to do the same thing in TBC, but I know it does in Classic, so don't quote me on that. But if it does, it kind of makes it crappy for Enhancement, to be honest. But it allows you to really get your heal off, or it allows you to get a devastating combo. I'm thinking of like an EM, Chain Lightning plus Shock, even though unfortunately that guaranteed crit window is gone, but we'll talk about that later. But still, it's a lot of damage you can put out. So it definitely has its usefulness. I think Tauren's most likely the second best for PvP in my opinion. And War Stomp can even be used in PvE as well to control trash and stuff like that. Endurance, total health increased by 5%. It's good in every situation, it requires no user input, which is always nice, but it doesn't really benefit Shaman that much, unless you're Shaman tanking again, or unless that extra 5% stops you from dying, which I'm sure happens, but doesn't happen very often. Cultivation, Herbalism increased by 15, always nice for farming gold. Nature Resistance, increases nature resistance by 10. This is useful in rare circumstances or in PvP against druids and other shaman, so I mean it's a nice added bonus. The rundown, in my opinion, they're mediocre for PvE roles. They don't really have any offensive cooldowns they can use in PvE to help their DPS or healing output. They're good in PvP, and in my opinion, the second best in the Horde, and War Stomp's just great for control. Moving on to the newest addition to the Shaman ranks, the Alliance side, the Draenei. Space Goats. So, what do the Draenei get as Shaman? Inspiring Presence. Now, this is dependent upon what class you are. It's either spell hit or melee hit, and for Shaman, it's spell hit. So it's 1% spell hit for you and your party members. It's kind of nice. Definitely a nice added little buff. It's good early on in early endgame because your casters are really scrimping to get every hit they can get. Unfortunately, this is outscaled in later tiers as hit becomes more available, but it's definitely a nice added bonus in early endgame. Surprisingly, this is also really nice for Enhancement Shaman. Remember, you have to shock, and since melee hit and spell hit are two different things, you'll get melee hit from your talents and from gear, but you won't get spell hit. Having a 1% extra chance on spell hit is a nice little boost to DPS, so don't sleep on that. Gem Cutting increases jewel crafting skill by 5, which is great for leveling jewel crafting and potentially good for getting rare gems through prospecting. Gift of the Naru. This is probably the most interesting one. This heals your target or yourself, whoever you're targeting, for 187 every 3 seconds for 15 seconds at level 60 and 217 every 3 seconds at level 70. So that's a total of 1,085 health. Now what's interesting about this is it costs nothing. There's no mana cost and it is schoolless. Now what I mean by that is if you're ever silenced, you realize that you're usually silenced school wide. And since this doesn't have a school like frost or fire or healing, it's really good kick bait in arena. You can start casting this, a rogue can kick you and it doesn't lock you out of your other spells or your heals. So it's very, very cool in that situation. It also has 100% spell scaling. It's actually 110% if you're resto with purification. So it gets all of your bonus spell power or more depending if you have purification. That makes it not a bad little hot. And I say little because even with that coefficient, it's not going to get anywhere near priest renews or rejuves or anything like that, but it's still a hot, and shamans don't have hots unless you consider Earthshield a hot, which in my opinion is a pseudo hot. I really wouldn't call it a hot. It's a great spell, but I wouldn't call it a pure hot. I would use it during the pull when your tank needs some extra healing. I wouldn't waste the GCD on it if you're in the middle of a raid fight though, but it's definitely a nice little addition. I don't think it's as bad as people say it is, but I don't think it's good either. And the big downside, of course, is it has a 1.5 second cast with a long cooldown, 3 minutes. Use it when you can, but I would definitely use it. I wouldn't sleep on it. Shadow Resistance increases nature resistance by 10. Again, only useful in rare circumstances in PvE. PvE or in PvP against Shadow Priests and Warlocks. Rundown, well, this is your only choice if you're going Alliance, right? This is what you'll have to deal with. And I think they're cool. I think the starting zone is wonderful. I think that they have some cool flavor to them, especially because they get their own unique totem models. So that's really interesting. And if you played Journey, enjoy it. And welcome to the Shaman ranks. Let's get into random enchantment pieces. This isn't super important, but I wanted to add it because there's been some changes to it. By random enchantment, I mean those pieces you get, they're blue or green, and they have, of spirit, of the gorilla, of the monkey. That's what I mean a random enchantment. The piece drops, and then it rolls what the stats on it are. Now, the old random enchantments still exist in TBC, and they can drop in Outland as well as in Azeroth, except for the Abyssal pieces, which can only drop in Silithus. So that's the only old random enchantment pieces that will not drop in TBC zones. They'll still drop, but not in TBC zones. You have the health and mana regeneration ones. You have the animal ones, which there's a checkbox there so you can see which one's which. Of spirit, of intellect, of strength, stamina, agility, protections, frozen wrath, nature's wrath, all those. Those are still existing. They can still drop in TBC again, except for the abyssal ones. Now, there are some new random enchantment pieces that come out in TBC, and what's interesting about these is that they can drop in any TBC zone, including the starting zones, Bloodmist, Azure Mist Isles, or the Ghostlands and Eversong Woods. The only point about this is that we have a lot more new random enchantment gear that comes out. The spreadsheets here show you what they give. Not a huge deal for endgame at all, but I just wanted you guys to know that this stuff will be dropping. Now, the modifiers on these items have very specific drop rules. The suffixes, such as Physician and Prophet, will only be found on cloth gear. Other ones like Hierophant will only drop as leather. Bandit will drop as leather or mail. The drop rates also in these vary widely. The more standard types, such as Beast and Sorcerer, will drop frequently, while obscure suffixes like Knight are very rare and will only drop as blue quality gear. You will also notice that some suffixes have the same stats. These are differentiated by the amount of each stat available on the piece of gear based on which stat is emphasized. Again, look through them if you're interested, but I wanted to provide this information because it's new in TBC and it could impact your leveling process. So know which ones are good for your spec. Alright, time to go over the new universal shaman spells. These are spells that every shaman gets no matter what their spec is. You just get these as you level up. The first is Totemic Call. You get this level 30, which is great because you can use it while leveling. If you're leveling brand new, obviously. And this is the most amazing housekeeping addition that we've gotten. And this lets you recall your totems immediately. As you know, in regular vanilla, you put your totems down. The only way to replace the totem or move it is to put another totem with the same element type. No longer. So now we can click one button and they all get removed from the map, and it gives you 25% of the mana required to cast each totem back. If you have 4 totems down and then you hit Totemic Call, you get one of those totems basically for free. Huge housekeeping quality of life improvement in TBC. Next are the Fire Elemental Totem and Earth Elemental Totem. These have a shared cooldown, and it's 20 minutes, and these are really cool. So the Fire Elemental Totem is, of course, a Fire Totem, and the Earth Elemental is an Earth Totem. The Fire Elemental is like a nuke ad. He basically does like Fire AoE, good in raids, because you just click one button and you just add to the DPS, which is super nice. Now, if you're Elemental, obviously you don't want to use this very often because you want to have Totem of Wrath down, but on Trash, this would be really, really nice. But for Restoration and Enhancement, use it on cooldown for some extra damage. Earth Elemental Totem is a little bit different. Instead of a DPS nuker, it's a tank ad. Super great while leveling. Imagine, if you have an elite you have to kill, you can pop this guy out. He'll tank for you. In dungeons and raids, he could potentially be an emergency tank if something gets loose. So really, really cool totem. A lot of flavor as well. The next is Wrath of Air Totem, which is an air totem. You get level 64, and this totem increases spell damage and healing by 101 for you and your party members. Obviously, a huge boost for Elemental and Restoration Shamans. You're going to be using this in your groups no matter what. And it's great while leveling, great while soloing. It's just a really, really good totem. This is kind of like the Wind Fury for Elemental and Restoration. Next is Water Shield, and I highlight these ones in yellow because I think they're the most important. Water Shield is huge. It's going to be used by every Shaman spec, even Enhancement. It is a MP5 generator. So this shield gives you 50 MP5 just by having it on. And if you're attacked, it's kind of like Lightning Shield. It has 3 charges. If you're attacked, you get 200 mana back. There's a hidden GCD. It's like a 3-second GCD, but still, so you can get mana back as you get hit. If there's AoE pulses or there's something hitting you or something like that, you get mana back. And then you refresh it, and it's 100% free. There's no mana cost. The only thing that costs to you as the caster is a GCD. So there's no reason, none, why this thing shouldn't be up 100% of the time in PvE situations. Even in PvP, it has its usefulness. You're going to be getting hit as an Enhancement Shaman or a Resto or Elemental, and you get mana back as you get hit. Now, Lightning Shield still has its use, in my opinion. If you just want to burst something down in the world, I would use Lightning Shield, but Water Shield kind of makes Lightning Shield obsolete in a lot of different ways. I think over time, it's better for leveling, even though Lightning Shield does generate damage and it's got a really good HPME, but still Water Shield is just a way to go. I can't say enough good things about this. Also, if you're Restoration, your meta gem most likely will be Insightful Earthstorm Diamond, and this can proc that. And we'll get into that later in the Restoration Theorycraft section, but since it's free, you basically have unlimited reasons to proc your Insightful Earthstorm Diamond, and that's even more MP5. Just note you cannot have Lightning Shield, Water Shield, or Earth Shield on you at the same time. You can only have one of your elemental shields. And the next, last but definitely not least, is Bloodlust or Heroism. Bloodlust for the Horde, Heroism for the Alliance. This is an amazing DPS cooldown that has a 10-minute cooldown, but that's only incurred by the Shaman who uses it. This is not like Wrath of the Lich King and onwards, where the entire raid gets a debuff or gets a cooldown like Sated for this ability. So this means that you can rotate Shaman around in your raid and use Bloodlust on the part of the raid that needs it the most. The highest DPS group, for example, which will probably be your Warlock group, or you can just Bloodlust your entire raid. And this allows you to have some theory and thought to how you're going to use Bloodlust. Super flavorful thing that's only in TBC. And if you don't know, increases melee, range, and spellcasting speed by 30% for 40 seconds. It's just a huge DPS burst. And because of this ability, Shaman will most likely be the most popular class in your PvE settings and in raids. You'll have 5 Shaman pre-trade because of this, because of the amazing utility of Bloodlust paired with our totems. Now we're going to go over each spec's new talents, so things that were not in Classic Vanilla that have been added in TBC. So these are totally new. These aren't changes to old talents. That's a different section. We'll go over that later. These are just new talents. So the first for Elemental is Unrelenting Storm. This talent allows you to regenerate mana equal to 2% of your intellect every 5 seconds, even while casting, and that's 2% each rank for a maximum of 10% of your intellect every 5 seconds while casting. This is basically a built-in MP5 generation for Elemental Shaman. One of the biggest issues and things holding back Elemental Shaman in PvE settings in Classic Vanilla was their mana pool. So here's a way to increase the mana pool, and the developer saw that was an issue and rectified it. And this will be a required talent for PvE. Next is Elemental Precision, which increases your chance to hit with Fire, Frost, and Nature spells by 6% and reduces the threat caused by Fire, Frost, Nature spells by 10%. So that is the max rank, obviously. It's 2% hit with each rank and threat reduction by 4, 7, and 10%. Again, this is a required PvE talent. Having it the 16% hit can sometimes be a pain in the butt. The fact that you get 6% from this talent and a 10% threat reduction, and threat in TBC is a lot bigger of an issue, and we'll get into the reasons why at the end of the guide, but having a threat reduction talent is very, very important for PvE, so this is a great pickup. Next is Elemental Shields, which 2% each rank reduces the chance that you'll be critically hit by melee and ranged attacks. With 3 out of 3, you get 6% reduction in the chance to be critically hit. This is obviously a PvP talent, and with Resilience, which does the same thing. The more resilience you have, the less you'll be crit and the less crit damage you'll take. This just builds on top of that, and this is an amazing PvP talent. So this is something you'll be taking if you're doing Arena as an Elemental Shaman or Battlegrounds, obviously. The next is the most flavorful ability, in my opinion, in the Elemental tree, Lightning Overload. Gives your Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning spells a 4% chance with each rank to cast a second similar spell on the same target at no additional cost, at no threat, and causes half damage. So with 5 out of 5, you have a 20% chance, this is kind of like Wind Fury for Elemental Shaman, a 20% chance to cast a half damage spell that mirrors the spell that you cast. So if you cast Lightning Bolt, you have a 25% chance to cast another free Lightning Bolt that does half normal damage. It can also proc on Chain Lightning. So what you'll see is you'll be casting your rotation, doing your Lightning Bolts and Chain Lightning, and then every once in a while you see these like random Lightning Bolts and extra Chain Lightnings just hitting the target, and it's just 100% passive. There's no user input involved, and it works out to be a 10% increase in DPS. 10% because it's a 20% chance at half damage, so 10%. The beautiful thing about this is that Blizzard could have just said, oh, this talent gives you 10% extra damage. But the fact that they thought about how awesome it would be to see extra lightning bolts pop out. Did you know, like, lightning is a random force of nature? So the fact that you just sometimes get extra ones pop out, it's just so cool and flavorful, class fantasy, and seeing this talent in action is just amazing. Definitely pick this up if you're PvEing or PvPing, obviously. And the 41-point elemental talent is Totem of Wrath. This is a fire totem that increases critical strike chance and hit by 3% for you and your entire party. Obviously, you want this totem down 100% of the time. It not only increases your crit and hit, but everyone in your party. And because of this, you'll be placed in caster groups to help casters out. And you usually have 2 elemental shaman per raid, one in the warlock group, one in the mage / whatever other caster you may have group for this totem. It's a huge benefit. It's one of the reasons we're taking the raids. ML DPS is pretty good early on. It gets outscaled by mages and warlocks for sure, but the fact you have this and bloodlust and your other totems just provides a lot of utility utility. That's what a shaman is, right? A shaman is all about the utility they bring to the raid. So an amazing 41 point talent. Not only it helps other people out, and it helps smooth out your gearing and stat priority process while getting ready for raids. And of course, it's not too shabby in PvP. Although you may want to drop it for nature swiftness in some situations. It depends on your comp and what you're really going for. Next, we have the new enhancement talents. The enhancement tree gets overhauled a little bit more than the elemental tree. The first thing you'll see is the shamanistic focus, and this you get pretty early on in the talenting system. And what this does is that every time you land a melee critical strike, you enter a focus state, and the next shock spell's mana cost is reduced by 60%. Very, very nice. While leveling, of course, you can actually use your shocks much more often. Using shocks is limited in vanilla classic because you have to keep your mana regen up and not break the 5-second rule. But the fact that they're more than half their cost every time you crit means that building that crit for flurry that you normally should do as enhancement shaman leveling now gives you an incentive to use your shocks more. Very, very cool talent. And in endgame will sustain you because you have to use shocks every cooldown. Like elemental shaman, enhancement shaman had some mana issues in vanilla classic as well. This is yet another way to relieve that. The next you'll hit is spirit weapons, and what this does is there used to be just parry in vanilla classic, but now this also gives you the chance to parry melee attacks and reduces all of your threat by melee attacks by 30%. As you saw in elemental, there's a threat reduction talent, and there will also be an enhancement. So as I said, threat's much more important in TBC. This is an obvious pickup for enhancement. I will say real quick for the people who want a shaman tank out there, this is a double-edged sword. Obviously you need parry to mitigate damage, and the fact that it reduces your threat just makes this talent kind of like, oh man. So again, one of those things that kind of really reduces shaman tanking. The next one is mental quickness. This reduces the mana cost of your instant cast shaman spells by 6%, so your shocks, and your storm strike, and increases your spell damage and healing by amount equal to 30% of your attack power. This is a huge talent. The fact that you're going to be using shocks on cooldown, and now you get 30% of your attack power as spell damage is amazing. This is a great talent for obvious reasons, and something you'll pick up for PvE and PvP. The next and biggest in my opinion is dual wield. It allows one-hand offhand weapons to be equipped in the offhand, and it is the superior DPS strategy for PvE. Now, two-handers are still obviously will be used in PvP for certain reasons, and we'll get to that later, but dual wield is just a overall increase in DPS. And then dual wield specialization, which unlocks after you hit dual wield, increases the hit while dual wielding by additional 6%. As you know, when dual wielding, you have a hit penalty and a much higher hit cap, so any hit you can get is amazing. So you get 6% from this talent if you go 3 out of 3. The next is Unleashed Rage, which causes your critical hits with melee attacks to increase all party members' melee attack power by 6% if 3 out of 3, if within 20 yards of the shaman. This is primarily the reason why you'd be taken into melee groups, providing a 6% boost to attack power just by you critting. And this lasts 10 seconds, so this should have near 100% uptime because of dual wielding, how often you attack and how often you'll be critting, especially with Wind Fury, Storm Strike, should have a high uptime of this, near 100%. This, in addition to Wind Fury and Strength of Earth and potentially Grace of Air for your totem twisting, is just another buff you're providing to the melee. If Wind Fury wasn't enough, Enhanced Shaman get even more. It increases their damage as well. An overall great talent. And the 41 point talent is Shamanistic Rage. This is a 2-minute cooldown that reduces all damage taken by 30% and gives your successful melee attacks a chance to regenerate mana equal to 30% of your attack power. This essentially is evocation for you. You're going to use it every 2 minutes during an encounter to regenerate mana, and it's not too shabby either. You can get like 60 to 70% of your mana bar back from this ability depending on how often you hit and the RNG behind it. The proc chance for this ability is approximately 35%. I haven't tested this on my current client. I'm going to test this when Classic comes out, but from the Theorycraft I've seen from TBC era, the proc chance is about 35%. So approximately 1 in 3 of your attacks will regenerate mana, and the more attack power you have, the more mana will be returned to you. With high attack power, you can get a substantial portion of your mana back, especially if you're dual wielding, because you'll be attacking more often when you're dual wielding. Another reason why dual wielding is superior to two-hander. And if you're totem twisting, you may have to be a little bit more strategic when you time this, but in general, I would use it whenever it's up. Now, the other part of this talent is it reduces all damage taken by 30%, which is okay for PvE. It's hard to time damage burst and mana regeneration at the same time, but for PvP, it's super nice, obviously. It allows you to reduce the damage taken by 30% for 15 seconds and regenerate mana while you are attacking, so it's also a great PvP talent. Now let's move on to Restoration, which on the surface seems the least change, but there's a lot of innuendo that's going on behind the scenes. The first you'll see is Focus Mind. 10% each rank to reduce the duration of any silence or interrupt effect used against the shaman, and that maxes at 30%. This effect does not stack with other similar effects. So this is obviously a PvP talent, something you're going to want if you're in the arena, or if you're in Battlegrounds, that just reduces any silence effect you have on you, which is great because Restoration Shaman aren't very mobile. We don't have really any instant casts except for Earth Shield, so So this is going to be a really big talent for Arena. The next is Nature's Guardian, which whenever a damaging attack is taken that reduces you below 30% health, you have a 50% chance, 10% each rank, to heal 10% of your total health and reduce your total threat level on that target. This will be used in PvE resto builds. You'll put 3 out of 5 into this, so you won't have a 50% chance of a 30% chance, but in PvP this is much more used, and you need to put the points in to get further, so it's a nice added bonus in PvE to know that if you get damaged below a certain point in your health pool, you can potentially heal yourself and reduce threat, which is good because threat again is an issue in PvE more than it was in Classic Vanilla. Overall, nice talent, but more of a PvP centric one. The next, which is the biggest as far as overall healing throughput, is improved chain heal, which increases the amount healed by your chain heal by 20%. Now, what you're probably thinking is, that sounds good, of course I'm going to get it, but it really can't be that good, because in Vanilla WoW, all of these types of talents that increase your healing by X spell by some percent only affected the base range of that spell. That is not the case in TBC. The 20%, or 10% each rank, so 20 total, gets added to the spell's coefficient. So it increases how much of your healing power gets put into chain heal. Chain heal is a 2.5 second cast, so you only get about 71% of your healing power in Vanilla Classic. This, along with Purification, which we'll get to in a little bit, bumps it up into the 90s. This talent is absolutely incredible, and it makes Chain Heal, which is already a powerful spell, more efficient and have higher throughput. You have to get this. And we'll get into a little bit more into the Restoration Theorycraft section, but this is an amazing talent. The next is Nature's Blessing, which increases your spell damage and healing by an amount equal to 30% of your intellect. You're going to be in intellect on all of your gear. It comes with it, and with each point of intellect, you get 0.3 spell power. So with 1,000 intellect, you have 300 spell power. That's amazing. So this is just a overall boost in healing potential and throughput, and a must-have for any Restoration Shaman. The last 41-point talent, which is a great new addition, is Earth Shield. As you know, Shaman only had 3 heals in Classic Vanilla: Lesser Healing Wave, and Chain Heal. Chain Heal was, of course, amazing. The other 2 are useful, but obviously most of our healing comes from Chain Heal. Now we have something we can put on a tank. It's kind of like a pseudo-hot. It doesn't have a absolute duration like a hot does. All hots have an absolute duration. Earth Shield's kind of like Lightning Shield and Water Shield, where it has the hidden internal cooldown of 3 seconds. But whoever you put it on, you can put it on yourself too. Primarily in PvE, this is going to be put on tanks. Every 3 seconds or so, as they get hit, they get healing. And you just put them on. It has 6 charges. And in PvE situations, this is going to last approximately 30 seconds. And it just heals the tank. And there's no other input from you but just putting it on them. And even more beneficial is that the healing that's generated from Earth Shield gets attributed to the player that it's on. So the game thinks the tank is healing themselves. Therefore, any threat produced by Earth Shield gets put to the tank's threat table, not yours. Again, this is an amazing heal, and something that at least one of your Restoration Shaman will be in charge of putting on the main tank at all times. If there's another Restoration Shaman, they can put it on an off tank, or maybe somebody else. It's very, very good in PvE, and it's a leave and forget tank heal, and a new addition to our healing arsenal's Restoration. In addition to the healing portion, it also provides a 30% chance of ignoring any spell interruption when damaged. So this is something you can put on casters as well, and that is an additional benefit, but primarily this is going to be put on the tank to just heal them over time. Obviously in Arena, this has a lot of implications as well. Putting on your arena partners, putting on yourself while you're getting trained. This is going to be a very, very good talent to use in any aspect of Classic TBC. Next part of the video guide, we're going to be going over changes to old talents. So changes to talents from Vanilla in TBC. The first change for Elemental is Elemental Focus has been entirely restructured. Elemental Focus in Vanilla Classic was a 10% flat chance for a free cast on your next spell. So when you would cast the spell, you'd see the proc, and you know that your next cast would be entirely free. In TBC, it's based around Critical Strike. So every time you land a Critical Strike with Fire, Frost, or Nature spell, you enter a clear casting state, and the next 2 spells have a reduced mana cost of 40%. This sounds worse, but it allows you to put clear casting in your power. If you boost up your crit, you have more clear casting opportunity, and therefore you're saving more mana. This is why crit is such an important stat for Elemental Shaman. We already get double damage thanks to Elemental Fury, and now since we have this talent, you're basically building your mana conservation through crit. And that's why you'll see any guide out there pretty much, and even the latest jerks agree to this, crit should be around 30 to 40%, and 40% is optimal. So you want to try to get 40% crit as Elemental Shaman because of this talent. This, coupled with Unrelenting Storm, is essentially your mana conservation package as an elemental shaman. This is a required talent for both PvE and PvP. The next is Call of Thunder. This is a very minor change, but it used to give 6% crit with 5 out of 5 in vanilla WoW, and now it gives only 5%. We lose a percent crit from this talent. It's not a huge deal. We still come out of the gate with a lot of crit thanks to Totem of Wrath and Nature's Guidance and Restoration, so we come out with more crit than we did in vanilla, but this talent gets nerfed a little bit. Third is Lightning Mastery. This is an interesting one. What Blizzard did was they actually decreased the cast time of Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning by 0.5 seconds. In Vanilla Classic, Lightning Bolt was a 3-second cast, and Chain Lightning was a 2.5-second cast. And if you put 5 points into this talent, it would reduce them by a second each, so Lightning Bolt was 2 seconds, and Chain Lightning was 1.5. However, in TBC, Lightning Bolt has a base cast time of 2.5, and Chain Lightning has a base cast time of 2 seconds. So this talent, instead of giving 0.2 seconds off, it gives 0.1 per rank. You still get the same output, you still get a 2-second Lightning Bolt cast and a 1.5-second Chain Lightning cast. Okay, everything seems fine, right? Well, not really, because remember, if you know anything about spell coefficients, the way you determine spell coefficients is you divide the base cast time, the untalented cast time, by 3.5. So since these two spells have been reduced in cast time, they have a smaller spell coefficient. This is actually a little bit of a nerf. However, Blizzard bumped them up a little bit. It's still not the full spell coefficient, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what this means in the Elemental Theorycraft section, but all you need to know right now is that this talent's been restructured because the cast times of Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning base cast times have been changed, and this results in a slight nerf to the damage output of both of those spells. Again, we'll get into more of that later. So the last talent that changed, kind of, is Elemental Mastery. Elemental Mastery itself has not been changed at all. The tooltip remains the same. Every time you use this ability, your next Fire, Frost, or Nature damage spell has a 100% critical strike chance and reduced mana cost by 100%. Great. However, in 2.3.0, Blizzard patched out the Chain Lightning Earthshock combo. And I say Earthshock because that's the most damaging version of the combination, but of course you could batch this with Frostshock or Flameshock, but that's no longer possible as of 2.3.0. So the talent itself did not change, but an internal mechanism of it changed. And we'll get into that later in the Elemental section as well. Next are changes to old Elemental spells, not talents, but spells that are in the Elemental tree, or of the Elemental school. Many spells have small tweaks to their mana cost and their damage output. You'll see this across abilities in TBC. They just did minor adjustments. This is mostly pre-level 60 ranks though, so incremental reduction in both mana cost and average damage. It's very small. If you notice on the tooltips, things are a little bit different. This is why. However, the big changes are, like I said in the previous slide, Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning cast times have been reduced by 0.5 seconds, 2.5 and 2 seconds respectively. Now the coefficients have been increased to compensate the reduction due to the cast time reduction. Again, I'll go over exactly what that means in the spell coefficient section and the Elemental Theorycraft section. Next, Earthshock no longer has a 2x threat modifier. It has a 1x threat modifier. Again, this is a reduction in potential shaman tanking output, but the real reason why they did this is because they wanted Earthshock to be part of the enhancement rotation because it does so much damage, and they didn't want enhancement shaman pulling off the tanks. So this is a pretty good change. However, Frostshock now has a 2x threat modifier. So if you do want a shaman tank, you have a shock that you can use, and it is Frostshock. Earthshock and Frostshock still have their secondary effects of silencing and slowing, respectively, but the threat modifiers have been swapped. The next is Stoneclaw Totem. In addition to taunting mobs, it now has a 50% chance to stun them for 3 seconds. This is cool for PvP, and for PvE, obviously. For leveling, it's nice to know that you can stun mobs with your Stoneclaw Totem, but this is really cool in PvP because if you have someone who's like OCD and attacks all your totems, you can kind of bait them with this, and has a 50% chance on attack that stuns them. This is pretty cool, so definitely use Stoneclaw Totem in PvP situations because of this new mechanic. Let's now move on to Enhancement. How have old talents been changed in the Enhancement tree? Not as much as Elemental, but some things are definitely worth noting. So the talent itself has not been changed. However, Ghostwolf cast time has reduced by 1 second. So 2 out of 2 improved Ghostwolf now makes the cast instant. There is no cast time. This is really good for PvP. People either love or hate this talent for PvE, for leveling and soloing and stuff like that. I personally think that it could become a wasted talent point. I put it in something else because once you have your mount, it's somewhat obsolete. I understand getting away from situations is great as Ghostwolf, but there's other ways to get away. We could have this debate all day. Anyway, if you're PvPing, this is a must. So let's just say that for now. It's a great talent to use to be more mobile in Battlegrounds and Arena. We went over Spirit Weapons already. The only reason I put it here is because parry has been replaced by this. In addition to your chance to parry, you get a 30% threat reduction on melee attacks. Next is Toughness. So you still get the armor value from items by 10%, 20% if you put 5 points in this, but now it also reduces duration of all movement slowing effects on you by 50%, and that's 10% each rank. Toughness not only gives you more armor, it also reduces all movement slowing effects by 50%. This will be a good PvP talent. And finally, we have Storm Strike. We get a new icon, but that's not the big reason why I put this in here. Storm Strike was the only non-white swing Enhancement Shaman had. Warriors have all these different things. Bloodthirst if you're talented, Whirlwind. There's so many different things you can use in between your weapon swings. Shaman only have one, and it's Storm Strike, and waiting 20 seconds was just rough, and it was 16% of your base mana. Storm Strike just came at a significant cost, and if you missed or parried or dodged, it was terrible. Now, Storm Strike, when you're dual wielding, attacks with both your weapons at once. If you're using a two-hander, it's just your two-hander, obviously, but it's been reduced from 16% base mana to 8% base mana, so it's been halved in its mana usage, and it's only a 10-second cooldown now. It still gives the next two sources of your nature damage dealt to the target by 20%, so that's great, especially since you're using Earthshock a lot in your rotation as an Enhancement Shaman, but the fact that it's half the cooldown, half the mana cost, if you're dual wielding, you attack with both your weapons. This spell went from a good thing to have to proc Wind Fury, basically, to a sustained and regular part of your rotation as an Enhancement Shaman. Overall, an obvious upgrade. Next are changes to old enhancement spells, so spells from Vanilla WoW that are in the enhancement tree that have been changed in TBC. Again, just with Elemental, a few small tweaks have been made to mana cost and damage output of certain spells. For example, Frostbite Weapon does more damage per proc than in Classic, only in ranks 5 and below, and Lightning Shield cost is less to cast rank 7 and below. These are only changes pre-TBC ranks of spells. Now the big changes are, Rockbiter Weapon no longer grants additional threat per hit, and provides flat DPS, not attack power. For example, rank 7 now provides 40 DPS, not 653 attack power. And the conversion is about 14 DPS per 1 AP, and that's how they converted it back. Now, this is likely due to the fact they didn't want it to scale with some of the enhancement talents, specifically Unleashed Rage, which causes your crits to increase your attack power by 6%. The way Rockbiter Weapon worked in Vanilla Classic is it would actually change your attack power on your character sheet. It would increase. This would be your total attack power, and therefore Unleashed Rage would act upon that bonus attack power provided by Rockbiter. That's my theory as to why they shifted it to DPS and not attack power. It still results in the same damage output, but it's just not given to your attack power as a stat. Concerning the threat thing, again, we talked about how they're trying to nerf Shaman tanking. This is just another addition. Now Shaman don't have a weapon imbue that increases threat. Ghost Wolf, as I said in the previous slides, has been reduced from 2 seconds to 3 seconds, and if you put 2 points in Improved Ghost Wolf, it's now an instant cast. Purely instant. And finally, Grounding Totem. It still negates negative effects, but any effect will now destroy it, not just damaging ones. So if you know in Vanilla Classic you could ground like 2 polymorphs, you can't do that anymore. I'm going to test this again to make sure on the TBC client when it comes out, but I've seen this written in old TBC posts, and this is how it works on my client, so this is likely how it'll work in TBC as well. Changes to the old Restoration talent. Healing Grace reduces the threat generated by your healing spells with 15% with 3 ranks. It's 5% each rank. That didn't change. What did change was it also reduces the chance your spells will be dispelled by 30%. And the spell that's primarily dispelled by PvPers is Earth Shield. Earth Shield, of course, is a hot. It's a pretty powerful hot. It also can negate spell interruption. So it's very powerful used in Arena by Resto Shaman. If it reduces the chance it's dispelled by 30%, that's actually worth putting points into this talent. What we don't know yet is how Earth Shield will be dispelled. It should be dispelled in 2 charge increments. So 1 dispel, or 1 charge of dispel, should remove 2 charges of Earth Shield. However, we don't know exactly what they're going to use in TBC Classic because they changed a lot in TBC's lifetime. So I'm operating under the assumption that it's going to dispel 2 charges at a time. However, that may not be the case. Either way, this is a good talent to have in PvP because of that reason. The next is Mana Tide Totem. Now it provides 6% of your total mana every 3 seconds for 12 seconds. That's 24% of the player's current mana bar. It used to be a set amount of mana per rank. Now there's only 1 rank that scales with your intellect and enchants. Another interesting point is that mana cost scales with base mana only. So once you reach 70, the cost of Mana Tide Totem won't increase with your gear intellect. It only increases with the base intellect at level 70. So if you do a little bit of Mana Tide math, your base mana at level 70 is approximately 2,960 mana. 3% of that is 88 mana cost. If you have 5 out of 5 Totemic Focus, it's only 66 mana to put down Mana Tide Totem. If you have 8,000 mana at level 70, Mana Tide Totem will restore 24% of total mana to each party member. For you, that's 1,920 mana. Your net gain is 1,854 mana, and it will also give mana to your allies based upon their total mana. In vanilla, the max rank mana tide totem costs 45 mana with 5 out of 5 totemic focus, so a little bit cheaper, but again, you're level 70 now. And it restored 1,160 mana to each party member, and your net gain was only 1,115 mana. So there's a breakpoint, actually, to where the new version of Mana Tide becomes superior to old Mana Tide. And it's approximately around 4,921 mana, which isn't that much. At level 70 with 5 out of 5 totemic focus. I have more mana than that now in vanilla. And just remember, the more mana you have, the more powerful Mana Tide becomes, as the cost of spells do not change. One thing to note, even though Ancestral Knowledge increases your total mana, it does not increase the cost of Mana Tide totems. That's a good thing to know. There are 2 more changes of note that we have to talk about for restoration to the old talents. The first is Purification. On the surface, this talent has not changed at all. It's the exact same tooltip from vanilla. However, what this talent did in vanilla, it just increased your healing spells base ranges by 10%, not their ranges after spell coefficients were put into play. In TBC, it increases the spell coefficient by 10% with 5 points in this talent, 2% each rank. This makes it much more impactful. Getting an additional 10% of your healing spell power applied to your spells is amazing, and it's going to increase your healing throughput significantly and your healing per mana efficiency. In a very similar way, we can talk about Healing Way, which Healing Way has a 100% chance to increase the effectiveness of subsequent Healing Wave spells on that target by 6% for 15 seconds, and this stacks 3 times. This also no longer affects the base range of spell. Now it affects the actual spell coefficient of Healing Wave by increasing it by 6% with each application. So if you have 3 stacks of Healing Way, your Healing Wave spell is 18% more effective by the spell coefficient. So in addition to the actual spell coefficient, which is 86%, another 18% of your spell power will be applied to this spell, making it an incredibly powerful single target tank heal. And you'll see this theme as we go into the spell coefficient section next, how a lot of these talents that just affected base ranges of spells in Vanilla Classic now affect the spell coefficients, making them much bigger pickups in both Restoration and Elemental. Finally, changes to old Restoration spells. Just like the other 2, many spells pre-level 61 have small tweaks to their mana cost and or healing or mana regeneration output. For example, Mana Spring Totem has been slightly buffed per rank pre-level 61. The big changes, of course, Improved Chain Heal, Healing Way, and Purification all increase the spell coefficients of their respective spells. And that's all spells for Purification, Healing Wave for Healing Way, and Chain Heal for Improved Chain Heal. And these are multiplicative if multiple of these talents apply. So example 1, Chain Heal with Improved Chain Heal and Purification, and example 2 is Healing Wave with Healing Way and Purification. Finally, Tremor Totem no longer pulses. It will instantly remove a fear, sleep, or charm effect. I'm still unsure if the totem can cleanse multiple effects that occur at the same time or similar times. I will check that when the TBC client comes out. But the fact that if someone's feared, you can just drop a Tremor and it'll wipe it right away, or if it's already down, it'll wipe it right away. It just makes Tremor actually good. If you played Shaman at all in Vanilla Classic, you know how horrible Tremor Totem can be. Like, it pulses, then the fear goes out, and the person's feared for like 3 seconds, or 4 seconds, it's horrible. Finally, Tremor Totem's an actually reliable removal of fear, charm, and sleep effects. Alright, we've covered a lot. We covered new stats, old stats, race of faction selection, new talents, how old talents have been changed, and new spells and old spells. Now it's time to talk about spell coefficients. So to start this, I like to do a little quiz. I have 2 pieces of gear here. One is the Bloodfire Talons and one is the Abyssal Melee Guards of Sorcery. Now I want you to tell me, the viewer, which one of these pieces of gear provides the most spell power. I want you to ignore all their stats and armor type, just to focus on the things I've highlighted in the red rectangle. The Bloodfire Talons says increases damage and healing done by magical spells and effects by up to 18, and the Abyssal Melee Guards say plus 18 damage and healing. Some of you have already seen this probably 30,000 times already because you've watched my videos, but for new viewers, are you surprised to know they both give the same amount of spell power? And they do. And that's because of something we call spell coefficients. And it's not your fault. Blizzard did some really poor language when it comes to these tooltips. The up to language is very confusing, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. There's no RNG behind this. It has to do with spell coefficients for each spell. So I'm going to explain what that means. As a shaman, not all of your bonus spell power or healing goes to your spells. Spells interact with spell power through what is called a spell coefficient. Now these coefficients are usually calculated from spell cast times, but that's not the rule for all spells, because some spells are instant, some spells are AoE, and some spells just have their own rules. A good example is Healing Wave rank 12, I put the tooltip here on the slide, which is a 3-second base cast time. To determine how much of your bonus spell power, in this case healing, goes to Healing Wave rank 12, you divide the cast time by the reference cast time, which is 3.5 in World of Warcraft. I don't know why it's 3.5. but it is. So 3.5 second spells get 100% of your bonus spell power applied to them, and everything below that gets a fraction of it. Healing Wave is a 3-second cast, so 3 divided by 3.5 equals 0.8571. We'll round that up to 86%. So this spell gets 86% of your bonus spell power. If you had 1,000 spell power, only 857 would go to Healing Wave, and you would add that to the average range of the heal. It's very easy to do. You take the average, the min-max, divided by 2, and you'll see that the average Healing Wave heal for rank 12 was 2,286 healing. If you add that number, 857, we determined from the spell coefficient, your new average with that much spell power is 3,143 healing. I won't go into how to calculate all these things. I've already made a video called the Downranking Guide and Tool. I've made a mana management video. We're working on a new downranking tool for TBC that should be out before launch. Anyway, if you want to know more about all this stuff, please watch that video. I go into more depth into how to calculate these things. One thing to note though, if you're watching this old video, there's a new mechanic brought into TBC called a downranking penalty, which I will explain, but that is not in Vanilla Classic, so that is not in that video. So it's something you'll have to learn from this video, but I suggest watching the old video first, then moving on to this one so we can talk about downranking penalties together. That's a perfect segue to talk about downranking changes in TBC. Before TBC, there was one downranking penalty, which was known as the pre-20 penalty, which penalized any spell that was trained before level 20. However, there's a new penalty coming with TBC called the downranking penalty, and this significantly penalizes lower ranks of spells. Lower meaning lower than the current level you are. The penalty actually is calculated by the difference between the train level and your current level. The equation to calculate the downranking penalty is the level the rank was trained plus 11 divided by your current level. If the result of this equation is greater than or equal to 1, then there is no penalty. However, if the value is less than 1, you would take this number and multiply it to the spell coefficient to get the new updated spell coefficient. Now, if the rank is learned before level 20 and the DRP is below 1, then you multiply both penalties to the spell coefficient, and we'll go over some examples of how to do that. Example 1 is with a no pre-level 20 penalty. Healing Wave rank 6, which is learned at level 32, casted by level 70. You take the spell coefficient, then you multiply it by the equation. 32, which is the level it was learned, plus 11 divided by 70 equals 0.5265 when you multiply it to the spell coefficient. So you only get 52.65% of your spell power, your healing spell power specifically, to that spell, which is much less than it was in Classic. Now I have a second example with a pre-level 20 penalty. Healing Wave rank 3, which is learned at level 12, casted by level 70. You take the theoretical coefficient, which is 0.7143, because remember rank 3 has a shorter cast time, multiply that by the pre-level 20, multiply that by the downranking penalty, and you get 0.1643. 16.43% of your spell power goes to Healing Wave rank 3. And the yellow there, I said, remember that since Healing Wave rank 3's base cast time is 2.5 and not 3 seconds, the theoretical coefficient would be smaller at 0.7143 before the pre-20 and downranking penalties. Finally, we have an example with no penalty at all, no downranking and no pre-level 20. Healing Wave rank 11, which is learned at level 63, casted by level 70. 63 plus 11 divided by 70 is greater than 1, so there is no penalty, so the only thing is the actual spell coefficient, which is 0.8571. Again, since it's greater than 1, I stop there. You don't multiply a number greater than 1 times the spell coefficient, because then you get a bigger number. You can never increase your spell coefficient unless there's a talent in play, like Purification or Improved Chain Heal, stuff like that, but this downranking penalty doesn't increase your spell coefficient if that equation's product is greater than 1. Just something to keep in mind. How does the downranking penalty affect the relationship of HPME or healing per mana efficiency on our heals? I have some examples to go through to tell you about that. Now again, I go through all this stuff in the downranking guide and tool video. So if you don't know what HPME is, or you have no idea what I'm talking about, you might want to watch that video first. But HPME is healing per mana efficiency. Essentially, spell power greatly affects the relationship between HPME and the ranks of your spells. Without any spell power, each rank of spell you learn gets more mana efficient and has a higher healing per second. However, spell power affects the relationship of HPME. It doesn't affect the relationship of HPS. Higher ranks will always heal more. However, it does affect the efficiency of each spell. And lower ranks of spells increase in efficiency at higher rates than higher ranks of spells due to their low range and the effect increase of spell power on those ranks. So here I have the same spell in Classic Vanilla and Classic TBC, Healing Wave. The breakpoint where rank 3 becomes the most mana efficient rank of Healing Wave happens around 212 spell power in Classic Vanilla because there is no downranking penalty. However, the relationship relationship is totally shifted and altered in Classic TBC, where rank 5 becomes the most mana efficient at 1191 spell power due to the downranking penalty and the pre-level 20 penalty. Doesn't mean that rank 5 Healing Wave is going to be your most used rank of Healing Wave. Doesn't mean that at all. It just means that the relationship of HPME is totally shifted because of this downranking penalty. Blizzard was attempting to have people use lower ranks less. That doesn't mean that downranking is not used in TBC. We'll get into that later, but I want you to just to realize how much this affects the relationship between mana efficiency and spell rank. Another way to look at this is the max rank, which on the left is rank 10, and on the right is the dark green, rank 12. Look how quickly the max rank, rank 10 in Classic Vanilla gets overtaken by lower rank as the most mana efficient rank, 212 spell power. It doesn't happen until 1191 spell power, and it's not even the same rank, it's rank 5 in Classic TBC. That's another way to look at this. It shifts everything to the right and up, essentially, in terms of mana efficiency. So now I'm going to go through each of the healing spells and show you exactly what I mean, the HPME breakdown with the downranking penalty. So Healing Wave HPME, again, we saw this in the previous slide, but I've just expanded this out to more spell power so you can see how the relationship continues. At 1191 spell power, rank 5 becomes the most mana efficient. That's the one in orange, where it supersedes rank 12, and then it continues to be more mana efficient. In most circumstances, when a breakpoint happens, it'll keep going in that direction. There are some crossing over you'll see in other spells. Again, this doesn't mean rank 5 is your best choice to use for healing. It just means it's the most mana efficient rank. And we'll go over in the Restoration Theorycraft section which ranks of Healing Wave you're going to be using in raids to maximize both HPS and HPME. Remember, just because rank 5 is a high HPME doesn't mean it has high HPS. In fact, it doesn't. It's a very low rank of Healing Wave. Lesser Healing Wave. There are actually 3 breakpoints here with Lesser Healing Wave. At 1000 spell power, rank 4 becomes the most mana efficient. At 1041 spell power, rank 3 becomes the most mana efficient. And at finally 1124 spell power, rank 1 becomes the most mana efficient. Again, I just want to show you what this relationship looks like, how HPME evolves with spell power, but you will not be using rank 1 Lesser Healing Wave. You will be using max rank, potentially one other rank in raids, because their HPS is so much higher. Moving on to our most important spell, Chain Heal. At 462 spell power, rank 4 becomes the most mana efficient, which is the first new rank you'll come across in TBC, but at 464 spell power, rank 1 becomes the most mana efficient, and that was of course the same thing in Classic, and rank 1 is still used in TBC for healing. It may not be the most common rank you'll use, but it's still in your bar. This is one of the exceptions where the most mana efficient rank is still used in raiding, and you'll be using rank 1 as a trickle low output heal in raids and TBC. This is primarily because of purification and improved chain heal boosting the coefficient so high, which gives rank 1 a respectable HPS and the highest HPME. Next we have Earth Shield, and the spell coefficient I use here is for all charges, so the total, and I'll get to that when we get to the spell coefficients of each spell. But the breakpoints happen very, very quickly. At 69 spell power, rank 2 becomes the most mana efficient, and at 115, rank 1 becomes the most mana efficient. Again, you will not be using rank 1 and rank 2 unless there's an emergency and you have no mana. You'll be using rank 3 all the time. I just wanted to show you the relationship of how this works. Since Earth Shield is learned much later compared to the other spells, this is actually a 41 point talent, meaning their downranking penalties are much lower than other spells, which is why these breakpoints happen so quickly at so little spell power. So this begs the question, and I kind of covered this already, are lower ranks better than higher ranks? And the short answer is, it depends. Just because a low rank becomes more mana efficient due to increase in spell power, it doesn't make it better than a higher rank spell. HPME inflations occur because of how small the effect ranges are on low ranks. Spell power affects them at a greater rate, increasing their healing per mana relationship significantly. Higher ranks, however, will always produce more healing per second than a lower rank. However, all that healing may not be needed in every circumstance. This is where lower ranks shine, as they are cheaper. So I have 2 exam questions for you. 1, your tank is about to die, but so is the boss. You have only 500 mana left. Do you cast Healing Wave rank 8 or Healing Wave rank 5? And Healing Wave rank 8, of course, has a higher range of heal, but has a higher mana cost. Exam question 2, a melee in your group made a stupid mistake and stood in fire very briefly. He or she likely won't do it again, and they only need 400 health to cap. Which rank will you use? Rank 5 or rank 8? Well, if you chose B for exam question 1, you are correct. Rank 8, you have no idea what could happen in the next few seconds. Your tank could be crushed or crit, and rank 5, even though it's the most mana efficient, may not be enough to save him. In this case, use the higher rank. Exam question 2, A is the correct answer. Rank 5. In this circumstance, there is no reason to expend the extra mana, as this will result in a a significant overheal, which is always a waste of mana. In this circumstance, the lower rank is better. So what I'm trying to say here is, are lower ranks better than higher ranks? It really depends on the situation, to be honest. I'll use AQ40 as an example. The trash packs after Twin Imps do a lot of damage. Therefore, I use rank 3 chain heal exclusively to heal my raiders due to the amount of damage that can come out. Before that though, I use primarily rank 1 because damage spikes aren't as high. Of course, it doesn't mean I don't use rank 3 or rank 2, but I don't use them as much as rank 1. And over time, you'll get to know as a healer which rank is better for most situations as you progress through raids. But the point of this slide is that downranking is still important, and it's not so much are lower ranks better than higher ranks, it's which rank is better for which situation. Knowing what you know now, should you downrank in TBC Classic? Short answer, yes. Even though downranking has been nerfed, remember lower ranks will always cost less mana, and therefore may be better in certain situations. The more spell power you have, the more mana efficient downranking becomes. We will get into specific downranking recommendations for heals and restoration theorycraft section, but this can confuse people sometimes. As we saw, the more spell power you have, the higher the HPME is for a low rank of spell. Early on, when you don't have a lot of spell power, you may use higher ranks more frequently, but as you get more spell power, you'll be more comfortable downranking because those downranked heals are more mana efficient and have higher throughput. Not as high as your high rank spells, but you'll notice you won't need the high rank spells as much. The same thing happens in TBC Classic, even though there is a downranking penalty, but that relationship is just shifted up and to the right more. But there's a lot more spell power available in TBC, which makes downranking more available. It is very important to remember that HPME is not the end-all be-all. HPS, or healing per second, is also extremely important when healing. Never use a rank just because it's the most mana efficient. Outputting as much healing as possible while also being mana efficient should be your goal. Lower ranks, excluding early ranks of Healing Wave, do not have lower cast times. You need to optimize how much healing you can put out in a window of time. Do not just focus on mana efficiency. Remember, HPS, healing per second, is calculated by the cast time. Are you wasting 3 seconds? Are you wasting 2.5 seconds by using too low of a rank of spell when you needed a higher one? Or perhaps you used too high of a rank of a heal and wasted mana due to overheal. Something that you'll have to optimize and get more comfortable with as you're healing. And as I said, downranking Earth Shield is usually a bad idea. There'll be more in the Restoration Theorycraft section on this. But I'm sure you DPSers are wondering, why the hell is Melderon only talking about healing? Isn't downranking important to use for DPSers? Not really. You should not downrank damaging spells unless you are dangerously low in mana or the fight is becoming so long that you have to downrank. Elemental Shaman can use Water Shield and keep up elemental focus much more in TBC. Because of these factors and consumables, you should not have as many mana issues if you use the correct rotation. Again, we'll go into that in the Elemental Theorycraft section. An Enhancement Shaman can always use Water Shield and have Shamanistic Rage, so you shouldn't be using lower ranks of shocks. DPSers want to maximize DPS. That's what DPS is all about. Why would you do inherently less DPS if you could do more? Healing is a very different animal. Healing is not about producing the most HPS because the risk of overhealing increases the higher rank of heal you use. If you only spam max rank chain heal, max rank healing wave, number one, you're going to go out of mana very, very quickly. Number two, the chance that a vast majority of that heal be overhealing and essentially a waste of mana is higher. There's no such thing as over DPSing in DPS classes. You do the most amount of DPS that you can in a given window of time. Healing is just a different animal. That's why I talk about healing when I talk about downranking. Time to go into each of the spell coefficients for each of our spells. I did the same thing way back in Vanilla Classic before the game came out, and then I did it again after the game came out to double check and make sure what things have changed or what was wrong on the private server. So you may be asking yourself, Melderon, why even go through that again? Why test all these things on a private server and then test them again when TBC Classic comes out, either a beta or the live game? The first reason is simply that a lot of Theorycraft is available for the spell coefficients that were done during TBC, whether it be by latest jerks or other groups. So therefore, a lot of this homework's already been done back in TBC, so I don't expect a lot of things to change in Classic. The second reason is because it makes it easier for me to build out this framework now when I have less time during the beta. So all of my spreadsheets I use, I just gotta plug new numbers in when the beta comes out, and then I'll be able to double check things much more quickly when I don't have a lot of time, because I have to level the character up and then get items and gear that I need to test these things, and then I can just test them. And that brings up the third reason. A beta is not a sandbox, or the live game is not a sandbox either. In my own personal private server, I can spawn items, I can spawn weapons, I can make spell power items, I can put up my spell power to a certain point and then test things much more quickly. I can't do that if it's a beta or a live game. So the possibilities of my testing are actually higher on this private server, and if this private server did use accurate spell coefficient data from TBC that's already been calculated by people back in the day, in 2007 and 2008, this is actually a better testing environment. And the only reason I do double check things on the beta is just to corroborate what I've already done. So I can tell you, yes, these things are the same as they were back in original TBC and how they were on the private server. That's why. And as you can see on the screen, I put the disclaimer and I explain that I will be making a new video, Classic TBC Advanced Shaman Guide Part 2, and I will update any values that are not corroborating between this and the original Theorycraft done in TBC. So let's get started. Before I jump in, just let me explain how I'm going to set these up. The table you see will be each rank, the level trained, the Theorycraft coefficient, what it should be essentially, any pre-level 20 penalty, the downranking penalty, then the adjusted Theorycraft coefficient taking into account any pre-level 20 penalty and the downranking penalty, and then what I actually got when I tested it. If the numbers are in green, that means they're within the margin of error of what it should be. And if you see a green box with an arrow pointing to the coefficient, that means it corroborates how it was in vanilla. Basically, nothing's changed between now and vanilla. If it's red, it means something did change between vanilla and TBC. Let's start with Frost Shock. As you can see, there is no pre-level 20 penalty with Frost Shock since it's trained at level 20, the first rank, and there are downranking penalties. I applied those to the Theorycraft coefficient to get an adjusted coefficient. As you can see, these all line up very, very well on the private server. The max rank is 0.401, which is 40%, which it should be. And then if you add concussion, there is no change. It doesn't affect the spell coefficient. This was the same thing in Vanilla Classic. Now we got a Frostbrand weapon, which is the Frost Weapon Imbue. The only talent that should affect the spell coefficient is Elemental Weapons, which did affect the spell coefficient in Vanilla Classic. Now what's interesting is that it did not on my private server, but it did for Flametongue Weapon. This screams to me this is a bug. This is something that they coded it improperly. You're supposed to get a 5% increase in the spell coefficient with each rank of elemental weapons for Frostbrand and Flametongue, but as you see, you don't see that. There is a downranking penalty for Frostbrand weapon, and across the board that tested out very, very well. The only thing did not test out exactly what I thought it would was with elemental weapons. Again, I believe this will be the case for Classic TBC. You will see an increase in the spell coefficient for this weapon imbue if you have 3 out of 3 in elemental weapons. But as it was in Vanilla Classic, Frostbrand weapon receives 10% of your bonus spell power, unless of course you do have elemental weapons, which in that case, if you have 3 out of 3, it should be 11.5%. Next, we move on to the fire spells. Let's first do the initial damage portion of Flame Shock. This is the part of Flame Shock that the damage you get when you first hit someone, not the damage over time effect. There is a pre-level 20 for some ranks of Flame Shock, and there's a downranking penalty as well. As you can see, everything mathed out very, very well. However, concussion did increase the spell coefficient by 5%. This was not observed in vanilla. This is one of the ones I could not find anything on the internet. I could not find that concussion was supposed to increase the spell coefficient in TBC, but since so many of the healing talents do, I wouldn't be surprised if concussion does act this way in real TBC, and I will check this, but it was coded that way in the private server where the initial portion of Flame Shock did receive a 5% bonus to the spell coefficient via concussion, which means I should have seen that in Frost Shock as well, but I did not. So again, the jury's still out on this, but everything else maths out perfectly well. Now let's move on to the periodic damage of Flame Shock. Very similar story here. Outside of 3 out of 3 concussion, everything cooperates with Vanilla Classic. You should get 13% of your spell power max rank here for the periodic damage, where it's 15% for the initial damage for Flame Shock. Again, you do see an increase of approximately 5% due to concussion, which you did not see in vanilla, and I am assuming that this is probably the case. In TBC, the concussion does affect the spell coefficient, but I will double check once again on a live TBC client. Moving on to Searing Totem. Now, what's interesting about Searing Totem, and a lot of the totems actually, is that there's no downranking penalty or pre-level 20 penalty for the totems. This was seen on Vanilla Classic. I'm assuming this is a bug. It would be very strange that magical totems did not apply to pre-level 20 and downranking penalties. I can see why they wouldn't, because why would you ever use a lower rank of a totem? But I think it was just laziness on the coding of the private server, because, you know, no one's ever going to use a low rank of Searing Totem. You would use low rank of Magma Totem though, to get people out of stealth and stuff like that. So again, I would be heavily surprised if this was the case. What's interesting is that the Theorycraft coefficient, so this is what people call for from original TBC, is 0.167, so 16.7% of your spell power. It was only 10% in Vanilla Classic, so this was likely increased in TBC to get more of your bonus spell power. At max rank, that's exactly what I got, approximately 0.167 as a tested coefficient. Now what's interesting is Call of Flame did affect the spell coefficient by 5% each rank for a total of 15%. This was not the case in Vanilla Classic. Again, I think there was an overhaul in TBC for these types of talents to actually increase the spell coefficient versus the base range of damage. We see those with Purification, Improved Chain Heal, stuff like that. So I think across the board we're going to see those changes in TBC. But again, until I get an actual client, I will not be able to tell you 100% for sure. But I'm assuming we're going to get around 19% with Call of Flame for this totem at max rank. Moving on to Magma Totem, there is no pre-level 20 penalty since the first rank of the spell is trained at level 26. Again, what we saw with Searing Totem, the downranking penalty does not exist for this totem. I'm assuming this is just because of the server I'm using. I'm expecting to see a downranking penalty for lower ranks of this totem in TBC Classic. This was also bumped up as far as coefficient. It now receives 6.7% of your spell power. It was only 3.8% in Vanilla Classic. And as with Searing Totem, Call of Flame did affect the spell coefficient by 5% each rank, up to a total of approximately 7.5%. And as I said with Searing Totem, I will check this as soon as I can with an official TBC client. Fire Nova Totem. Okay, this one does have a pre-20 penalty and a downranking penalty, and it does actually test out that way when I did it on the client. So again, this leads me to believe that Magma and Searing were just coded improperly. Any type of spell should have a downranking penalty in TBC. As you can see, it tests out that way here. As with the other fire totems, the Theorycraft coefficient, what you should get from this spell, was also increased in TBC versus Vanilla up to 21.4% from only 12% in Classic Vanilla. And I did see, as with Magma and Searing, the Call of Flame did affect the spell coefficient, but it seems closer to 30% higher than 15. Now this is interesting. I saw the same thing in Vanilla. For some reason, Fire Nova Totem gets a boost from Call of Flame higher than you would expect, and that was the same case in Vanilla Classic when I tested this during the beta. Something weird about Call of Flame and the interaction with Fire Nova Totem. It gives more than 15%. I never could understand why this is, but this was the same thing I tested on the private server, and if it's the same thing in TBC Classic, it's an artifact. It's something that was maybe coded improperly and they never actually caught during Vanilla and TBC's lifetime. I will double check that when I get an official client to see if that's the same thing. Moving on to Flame Tongue Weapon. Now we should get 10%. That's the same thing from Vanilla Classic, and that's exactly what I got for max rank without the downranking penalty and the pre-20 penalty. And as what you would expect, we get 5% each rank added to the spell coefficient from elemental weapons for a total of 11.5%. This one tested beautifully, nothing surprising, and corroborates exactly what we saw from Vanilla Classic. Next is Lightning Bolt, which has a lot of changes due to Vanilla Classic. Number one, the cast time has been reduced, so the coefficient has been reduced because of that. But it was bumped up to approximately 79.5% by Blizzard to compensate for the reduced cast time. So that's what you should be getting, 79.5% at max rank at level 70 without anything else applied. That's exactly what I got. Remember, Storm Strike, that nature damage dealt increase by 20%, does affect the spell coefficient, and we did see that in Vanilla Classic, and I see that in TBC Classic as well. So if you are attacking a mob with the Storm Strike buff, you get 95.3% or so near that of your spell power applied to Lightning Bolt. Now what's interesting is that Concussion did not affect the spell coefficient. It did not in Vanilla either. Again, Concussion I'm really on the fence about. I have no idea what it's going to do. We see some of the spells we talked about already, it has affected the coefficient, and some spells it hasn't. Until I get an official client, I'm not sure exactly what that's going to be. And there is no synergy if you have Concussion and the Storm Strike buff. It's still 95.3%. Across the board for Lightning Bolt, Concussion does not affect the spell coefficient, however the Storm Strike bonus does. Next, Chain Lightning, which should get a 64.1% Theorycraft coefficient applied to it. Again, this was reduced just like Lightning Bolt from a 2.5 second cast to a 2 second cast. With that comes a reduction in the spell coefficient, but as with Lightning Bolt, Blizzard boosted it up a little bit so it wasn't so low, like near the mid 50s up to 64.1%, which is respectable but still a slight nerf over the 2.5 second cast. Now what's really interesting about Chain Lightning is that there's no reduction in the coefficient with bounces. You should see a reduction in the spell coefficient that goes along with a 30% reduce in damage. There should be a companion reduction of 30% of the spell coefficient. You see that with things like Chain Heal, where the spell coefficient reduces because of the jump reduction. You don't see that with Chain Lightning, at least on my server. I think this is a bug, and I will test this, of course, when it comes out. Outside of this wonkiness, it follows the same thing that Lightning Bolt did, where Storm Strike does increase the spell coefficient coefficient by 20% and concussion does not. If this is actually true and there isn't a reduction in the spell coefficient due to jumping, so a 30% reduction in spell coefficient on the second jump and then a subsequent 30% reduction in spell coefficient on the third jump, this will make Chain Lightning even more powerful than it already is for trash and potentially in PvP situations as well. Now, Lightning Shield, like some of the totems, does not have a downranking penalty on my server. It should, but you should get 33% at max rank, and that's exactly what you get. So 33% of your spell power will be applied to each shield for a total of 100% spell scaling if you consider all 3 charges of it. Storm Strike does increase the coefficient by 20%. We saw the same thing in vanilla, and Improved Lightning Shield also affects the spell coefficient. This was not seen in vanilla. So I'm not sure exactly if this was altered in TBC, just like a lot of these talents were, to where instead of increasing the base damage of the spell, it increases the spell coefficient. However, I won't know until I have an official client. And what's interesting is we see a synergy between Improved Lightning Shield and Storm Strike, to where you get the 20% bonus and the 15% bonus for a total of 45.2% spell coefficient if you have both of these buffs active. It's really hard to rely on the Storm Strike buff, especially if you're in a raid, because you're going to apply Storm Strike. You're not getting hit by the boss unless there's an AoE pulse. You may get your Earth Shock on one of those charges, but remember, if you have Elemental Shaman in your raid, they're going to be stealing your buff as well. So it's hard to rely on the Storm Strike buff. When you're soloing, it's definitely something you can rely on. This is pretty cool if it's true, and again, I will corroborate this on an official client. Our last nature spell is Earth Shock, which should receive 40% of your spell power, just like it did in vanilla at max rank if you don't apply a pre-20 penalty or a downranking penalty. And that's exactly what I see. And just like vanilla, concussion did not affect the spell coefficient, and it doesn't on my server. I'm eager to see what spells concussion will work on in official TBC Classic. Also, Storm Strike does affect the spell coefficient by 20%, and we saw the same thing in vanilla. And this is good news because it'll be part of the enhancement rotation, and you'll be using Storm Strike as well. So boosting your Earth Shock damage will be great for Enhancement Shaman. Moving on to our healing spells. Now, Theorycraft calls for 85.7% of your spell power going to Healing Wave at max rank without downranking or pre-20 penalties. That's exactly what I see. That corroborates all the way through. What's interesting in TBC, though, is that Purification and Healing Wave both increase spell coefficient instead of increasing the base range of the spell. So Purification by 10%, Healing Wave with 3 stacks by 18%. And that's exactly what you'd see. So if you increase Purification, if you increase by 10%, you get 0.943 your spell coefficient. If you have 3 stacks of Healing Way, you actually get more than 100% at 1.01, and that's what I see as well. And if you have them both, if you have Purification and 3 stacks of Healing Way, your spell coefficient is 111%, and that's exactly what I see. So there's synergy between Purification and Healing Way. That's what has been called for from way back in the day in TBC proper theory crafting, and that's what I see on my client, and I'm assuming that's what we'll see in TBC Classic when it goes live as well. Moving on to Lesser Healing Wave, which should receive 49.2% of your spell power, considering it's a 1.5 second cast. This is exactly what I see at max rank, and the pre-20 penalty and downranking penalties corroborate all the way through. And with 5 out of 5 Purification, you get a 10% bonus to that coefficient, moving it up to 47.2%, and I get that as well. Now for Chain Heal. Let's start with the first primary target first. All of those things corroborate exactly what I thought they would. The base coefficient for Chain Heal is 71.4%, considering it's a 2.5 second cast for your first target. If you have Purification, it's a 10% increase, bumping up to 78.5%. If you have Improved Chain Heal, which is 20%, that bumps up from 71.4% to 85.7%. And if you have both, that's an increase of 20% and 10% multiplied for a total coefficient of 94.2%. Now, if you remember the Chain Lightning slide, I said that Chain Lightning on its second and third bounces does not receive a penalty to the spell coefficient. I did not know what I'd see for Chain Heal, but it was what I expected. You do see a 50% reduction in the spell coefficient, whatever it was on the primary target, on the secondary target, and then the secondary 50% reduction in the spell coefficient on the tertiary target. That's what I expected to see, and that's what I get. I don't see that in Chain Lightning, which makes me think that the Chain Lightning thing is a bug. I will check that again when I get live TBC access, but I'm assuming that there will be a 30% reduction in each jump to the spell coefficient, not only the damage of Chain Lightning, as we see here in Chain Heal. The important thing to realize here is that there's synergy between Purification and Improved Chain Heal. You definitely want both of these talents if you're going to be a healer. Bumping up the spell coefficient from 71.4% to 94.2% is huge, and that's what we should expect in TBC Live. Next is Healing Stream Totem, which, like the other totems I tested, did not seem to have a downranking penalty on my client. Again, I think that's wrong. We expect to see 4.5% of your healing spell coefficient each tick of Healing Stream Totem, and that's what I did get on the max ranks 5 and rank 6, which don't have a downranking penalty. Now, what I was expecting to see was 5 out of 5 Purification, boosting it up by 10%, which I did see, boosting it up to 4.95% on each tick, but I wasn't expecting to see the Restoration Totem's talent increase in the spell coefficient, because that did not happen in Classic Vanilla. I was expecting Purification to do that, because the Purification across the board increased the spell coefficient in TBC Classic, but I couldn't find any Theorycraft corroborating the Restorative Totems doing this. However, Restorative Totems does increase the effectiveness of the heal by 25%, boosting the spell coefficient to 5.58%, and it synergizes with Purification for a total spell coefficient if both of them are applied to 6.14%. This doesn't surprise me if this is true. I think that since Purification does this, I'm assuming Restorative Totems will also do a similar thing in TBC Classic, but until I have an official client, I will not know for sure. But the no DRP or no pre-20 penalty is obviously a bug. I think that we will see DRP and pre-20 penalties for this totem in live Burning Crusade Classic. Finally, our last heal and last spell will be covering in the spell coefficient section, Earth Shield. Earth Shield should receive 28.6% of your spell power each charge. And that's exactly what I see. Rank 1, of course, is a downranking penalty at level 70. What I tested was a little bit higher than what I should have gotten, but that could be due to sampling error or other issues as well. 5 out of 5 Purification does boost its spell coefficient by 10% to 31.5%, and ranks 2 and 3, which do not have a downranking penalty, that's exactly what I got. As with rank 1 without Purification, with Purification, the tested coefficient seems higher than what I should be getting, but again, this could be due to sampling error, and I'm sure this will be rectified in live TBC. Alright, spell coefficients are done. Now it's time to move into spec-specific Theorycraft. We'll be going over all available Theorycraft that I could find and that I've researched for each spec. Most of the points discussed here come from two sources: the Elitist Jerks web archives from actual live TBC back in 2007-2008, the links to those pages will be in the description below, and personal correspondence with spec experts and private server veterans on the Shaman Discord. And a special thanks out there to Hit Button and Egregious for answering any questions that I have concerning Enhancement, Elemental, and Restoration. It's important to note that metas may shift and change upon TBC Classic's release and observations made in endgame PvE and PvP. Private servers just get things wrong sometimes. And on top of that, new metas may develop based upon just new knowledge that is gained this time around. Even though the Elitist Jerks were at the top of the world when it came to Theorycraft back then, I'm sure there's stuff they didn't explore. And now TBC Classic provides us another chance to do those things. So what I'm going to be covering here is what's available, what has been already done in live TBC, what has been done in private servers, and what you should expect at least going into TBC Classic, knowing how to play your class as efficiently as possible. First, let's cover Enhancement, because honestly, there's a lot to go over. Enhancement is interesting to me. There's a lot of innuendo, a lot of idiosyncrasy, and there are a lot of aspects to cover. Restoration and Elemental, in my opinion, are very streamlined, very straightforward, where Enhancement has a lot of moving parts and a lot of different variables to consider. But generally, PvE DPS revolves around dual wielding to produce the maximum possible DPS. Weapon imbue selection depends on several factors, and we'll discuss that later. I think everyone thinks Wind Fury is the way to go, and that may not be the case depending on the weapons that you have. Totem twisting in a melee group between Wind Fury Totem and Grace of Air Totem provides the most benefit and utility. Also, maintaining 100% uptime of your Strength of Earth Totem. Shocks and Storm Strike will fill up any downtime between twisting resets. You should perform both on cooldown. And passive Unleashed Rage procs will also boost your fellow melee. That's kind of the sequence of events that's going to happen when you're playing Enhancement. Totem twisting is of course not required, but it is optimal and provides the most benefit to you and your melee group members. And we'll go over what totem twisting means if you don't know a little bit later. Mana management with Mana Spring Totem, Water Shield, and Shamanistic Rage will help you maintain DPS and twisting. You should never let Mana Shield or Mana Spring Totem lapse while you're DPSing. Get as much mana regen as you can. Let's go over the weapon imbues you have at your disposal as a shaman. Rockbiter weapon is both physical and consistent, and is not subject to RNG or outside modifiers, spell power, and attack power. It's good for leveling and perhaps very early endgame PvE. Flametongue weapon, like Rockbiter weapon, is consistent, but its damage source is magical, and it scales with spell power. Now, as an enhancement shaman, you have access to mental quickness, which increases your spell power based on your attack power, so this can buff Flametongue weapon. Flametongue's magical portion is on the melee hit table, but can be resisted or partially resisted just like a spell, so keep that in mind. Frostbrand weapon, like Flametongue weapon, scales with spell power and via mental quickness. However, it's a variable magical imbue with a PPM or procs per minute of approximately 9. Also, it applies as slow and can be resisted just as Flametongue. There's not many applications for this imbue, but just know that it is at your disposal and can provide a slow if needed. Finally, there's Wind Fury weapon, which is a physical variable imbue and grants 2 extra attacks on proc with bonus attack power. This has a 3-second ICD in TBC Classic. Now, generally, if you're using a 2-hander or 1-hander plus shield, the Wind Fury weapon proc chance is 20%, and I'm sure you know that from Vanilla Classic. However, there is a chance that this may be higher in TBC Classic. We will get into that in a later slide, but for all intents and purposes, it's a 1 in 5 chance that this will occur, whether in the main hand or the offhand, limited by a 3-second internal cooldown. Now, what's interesting is that Wind Fury weapon is the only imbue that scales with weapon damage, and I'll get into what that means also in a later slide, but this means it has higher potential damage ceiling compared to Rockbiter and all the other weapon imbues. Alright, what do I mean by Wind Fury weapon scales with weapon damage? On the screen we see 2 box plots. Box plots are a visualization of the spread of some data that we're analyzing. On the left we have Wind Fury, and on the right we have Rockbiter. I'm using 2 different weapons, so if we're looking at the Wind Fury box plot, the lighter blue colored box plot is the Rockbiter Cutter, which is a 65 DPS level 70 green weapon, and the darker box plot is the Gladiator's Cleaver, which is 91.2 DPS, it's a level 70 epic. Now the box plots we see on the left for Wind Fury are just including 4 Wind Fury procs, so that's the attack plus the 2 additional attacks for a total of 12 attacks, and I used all non-crit damage. On the right is Rock, and just as with the Wind Fury box plots, this is just non-crits. The same increase in DPS on the weapon results in a much higher difference in total damage in Wind Fury versus Rockbiter. This is a very simple concept. So you have a weapon that does way more damage, the Gladiator's Cleaver. 2 additional attacks of that weapon is a much higher damage increase than just the flat DPS total you get from the weapon itself. Rockbiter itself produces the same amount of damage per second regardless of the weapon that you have in your hand. Therefore, Rockbiter caps as soon as you get to the max rank of Rockbiter, you get the maximum effect. However, Wind Fury grants 2 extra attacks of the weapon you currently are wielding. So the higher the weapon damage, the higher the item level of the weapon, the more impactful Wind Fury weapon is. And you can see the difference between the 2 averages on Wind Fury is 93.25 DPS, where the difference with Rockbiter is only 54.92 DPS. This is what I mean when I say Wind Fury weapon scales with weapon damage. It's the only imbue that actually does that. Flame Tongue scales with spell damage, so the more spell damage you have, the more powerful it gets. So it's similar, but Rockbiter is the only weapon imbue that actually scales with weapon damage, making it have a very high damage ceiling. The higher your item level weapon, the more impactful a Wind Fury proc is. You may be saying to yourself, Melderon, you're cherry picking here. You're only using Wind Fury procs to make this comparison. I'm not comparing the DPS overall of these weapon imbues. The point of this slide is not to say Wind Fury overall is better than Rockbiter. The point is Wind Fury outscales Rockbiter. And as you get more gear and you get access to better weapons, Wind Fury will be better than Rockbiter. I'm just showing you the highest potential output and the difference between the highest potential outputs. Rockbiter has 1 consistent attack. It doesn't have anything different. It doesn't have an extra attack phase. What you see is what you get with Rockbiter, and that's the maximum difference you can achieve is based upon its non-scaling damage per second, whereas Wind Fury will get better with better gear. Now I'd like to go over two-hander viability versus dual wield. As I've stated already previously in this guide, dual wield provides more consistent DPS and a higher DPS output than a two-hander in a PvE setting. And commonly there's a misconception surrounding two-handers that since they have a higher top end, Storm Strike hits significantly harder when using a two-hander. And Elitist Jerks actually mathed this out. And if we calculate the comparison of 1500 attack power using Season 3 two-handed or one-handed weapons. And as you can see, the Storm Strike damage for a two-hander is a little bit higher, approximately 50-ish DPS. A little bit less than 50 DPS. On the surface, that would seem the two-handers are better, but there's a couple things, very significant things that you have to consider when dual wielding. Number one, your flurry uptime is higher when dual wielding. You have more attacks per second, therefore more chances to critically strike, and the flurry uptime is significantly higher when compared to a two-hander. Second, if you're double imbuing Wind Fury weapon, you have more Wind Furies per unit time, even with the 3-second ICD taken into consideration. Furthermore, Unleashed Rage is connected to your crit percentage, will be a higher uptime when you're dual wielding. And finally, you benefit more from plus hit while dual wielding, considering anything additional to the 9% hit cap will affect your white hits when dual wielding. With these aspects added up, dual wield far outweighs the higher top end damage of a two-hander. And if you want even more information on this, the enhancement page from Latest Jerks goes into this deeper. I didn't provide that information here because honestly, it's not worth the argument. Dual wielding has been shown to consistently have higher DPS compared to a two-hander of similar item level. However, in PvP, there are definite applications for two-handers. Think about low armor targets like Clothies. If you get a devastating two-handed Wind Fury proc, you could potentially one-hit them or near one-hit them using Wind Fury, finishing off low health targets in PvP, timing burst windows with the rest of your comp. Because of this, you should have an imbued two-hander at the ready in Arena if you are an Enhancement Shaman. But again, for PvE DPS, dual wielding far outweighs any benefit you may get from harder hitting Storm Strikes from two-handers. Think of it this way, dual wielding was added into the game by Blizzard for this specific purpose to increase the effective DPS of Enhancement Shaman, whereas two-handers are built built more for PvP, and there's obvious reasons why that is. Now we get into a big part of this section, and it's which imbue would you use for raiding. You have multiple options since you can put different imbues on different weapons, and it boils down to two potential options: double Wind Fury or Wind Fury main hand and Flame Tongue offhand. In private servers and even in original TBC, double Wind Fury is and was the way to go. There isn't a lot of theorycraft talking about why offhand Flame Tongue may be a good potential option, but it comes down to weapon speed. Let's get into what that really means. Double Wind Fury is highly contingent upon weapon speed. As a rule, if using Wind Fury, you want the slowest possible main hand and offhand. This is because the faster your offhand is, the more likely it will steal Wind Fury procs, because there's a 3-second ICD for Wind Fury. So the faster your offhand is, the more likely that the next Wind Fury will come from it instead of your main hand. This is not optimal because offhand attacks suffer a damage penalty, and slower weapons produce higher Wind Fury damage, therefore creating a suboptimal Wind Fury proc if your fast offhand takes it instead of your slow main hand. The only way to reduce this is to have the slowest offhand possible while also having the slowest main hand possible. Then really nice ranges between 2.6 to 2.8 second swing times. The graph on the right is a landscape plot, and it has 3 axes. The x-axis is your offhand speed, the z-axis is your main hand speed, and the y-axis is the percent of Wind Fury procs lost to your offhand weapon. As you see, the faster your offhand is, the more potential loss you'll get. In addition, the faster your main hand is, you'll also lose out. If your main hand and offhand are both fast, that red peak in the back, 65% of your Wind Furies will be lost to your offhand. In the foreground, in the closest part of the graph, if you see 2.6 seconds, that blue region, if your offhand and main hand are both slow, the percentage of Wind Fury lost to your offhand drops down to near 45%. This is a significant part of your DPS if you're using double Wind Fury, is to have the slowest main hand and offhand possible. Now this limits your choice of offhand, and that's why sometimes Flame Tongue might be better, because you may have only access to fast weapons. We'll get into why that is. But essentially, if your offhand is fast, you're losing a lot of DPS if you're double Wind Fury. And again, I alluded to this, but usually finding the slowest main hand possible isn't challenging. However, slow offhands are harder to come by. Two things you want to definitely avoid is don't even think about using Wind Fury Totem to escape the ICD. 1 extra attack versus 2 extra attacks is 100% not worth it. You will lose significant amount of DPS if you use the Wind Fury Totem to imbue your main hand, which again, the totem only imbues main hand or a two-hander. Additionally, using multiple Wind Fury ranks will not break the ICD. This was fixed. It used to be that way in very early TBC, whereas you can put 2 different Wind Fury weapon ranks on your main hand and your offhand, and you would circumvent the ICD. That is not possible. So the TLDR of this slide is, if you're going to double Wind Fury imbue, you got to make sure your offhand is slow and your main hand is slow. And I've tested this on my own sandbox, and my data corroborates this, and we'll get into that in a second. Another thing to consider that's very significant if you are using double Wind Fury is this 36% proc feature. This is very interesting. There's a curious thing that occurred throughout of all of TBC concerning double Wind Fury imbuing. If dual wielding and both weapons are imbued with Wind Fury, then the chance that a successful melee attack outside the 3-second ICD procs Wind Fury for some reason is 36%, not 20%. To clarify, when both weapons are imbued with Wind Fury, the chance for a main hand to proc is 36%, and the chance for the offhand to proc is 36%. This is not some statistical theory trying to extrapolate the combined Wind Fury proc chance due to dual wielding. It's not that at all. It's a feature or bug that was never rectified in all of TBC, but was fixed sometime in Wrath of the Lich King, and I'm pretty sure even my client has this. Whether it'll be in Classic TBC is anyone's guess at this point. They may fix it, I don't know, but it was part of TBC, and there's no explanation for it. If this is the case, double Wind Fury is probably going to be the best way to DPS in endgame enhancement PvE. If it's not in the game, there's a very real chance that Wind Fury Flame Tongue will outperform double Wind Fury. It's all really contingent upon this feature, and if it's in Classic TBC or not. Going forward through the rest of the presentation, we're going to assume that this double proc feature is in the client that I tested, and there's some evidence that shows that it most likely is. But if it's not, again, I'm going to have to test this all over again in Classic TBC and see if the same results come out of this. But it's a very interesting thing, and keep an eye out for it, for sure, in Classic TBC. The reason I put this slide in this presentation is because this was talked about on the latest Jerks Enhancement Theorycraft page. If you want to read more about it, head to that. But I also talked to my correspondents in the Classic Shaman Discord, and this is a very big thing, and this is something that we're anticipating will be in the game or not. So now let's talk about Wind Fury's rival, Wind Fury Flametongue. And there's 3 reasons why Wind Fury Flametongue could be superior to double Wind Fury. Again, like I said, if the 36% proc feature is not in TBC, Wind Fury Flametongue may surpass Wind Fury in overall DPS. And that's partially for 2 reasons. Wind Fury is speed agnostic due to slower weapons contributing more to Storm Strike versus faster weapons receiving more from spell power per unit time. Let's unpack this. This is a big point with 2 different graphs that are trying to explain what I'm trying to say here. The top graph is weapon speed with DPS contribution on the y-axis. The orange line represents Flametongue spell proc DPS versus Storm Strike with Wind Fury Flametongue imbue. The slower the offhand weapon is, the more it contributes to the Storm Strike portion of your DPS. However, the faster the offhand is, the more it contributes to the fire part of the damage. That's because, if we go to the graph on the bottom, the faster your weapon speed is with Flametongue, the more damage per second the spell power portion contributes. Now let me try to explain this. We have 2 different color lines on here. We have brown and we have orange. Brown represents the base damage of Flametongue itself, without any additional spell power applied. As you can see with weapon speed, the Flametongue base damage, the damage per hit, the solid brown, increases with weapon speed. That's because Flametongue has an internal scaling mechanic. The faster your weapon is, the more it hits, therefore the less damage per hit it produces. But the dotted line shows the DPS of that portion. The DPS remains constant. The scaling of that damage is proportional, and over time will produce the same DPS no matter what your weapon speed is. So if you have 0 spell power, it doesn't matter how fast the weapon with Flametongue is. It will produce the same damage per second, even though the damage per hit is contingent upon weapon speed. I know that's confusing, but if you think about it, I guarantee you'll start to get it. However, the spell power addition to Flametongue, remember it's a 10% spell coefficient, 11.5% if you have elemental weapons, acts completely differently. The Flametongue spell damage portion, damage per hit, is the same regardless of weapon speed. In other words, if your weapon is 2.8 seconds, and let's say you have 100 spell power, and you don't have 3 out of 3 elemental weapons, the additional damage contributed by your spell power is 10 damage. That 10 damage is applied to both a 1.3 second swing and a 2.8 second swing universally. It doesn't depend on weapon speed. So you get more damage out of your spell coefficient the faster your weapon is, considering each hit gets 10% of your spell power. So the solid line, unlike the brown line, the damage per hit remains constant, yet the DPS actually decreases from your spell power portion the slower your weapon is. I know that's a lot. Think about what I'm trying to say here. Essentially, the reason why Flametongue is a speed agnostic weapon imbue is because the faster your weapon is, yes, you get more out of the Flametongue portion, you get more out of that bonus spell power, but the slower your weapon is, you get more out of the Storm Strike. TLDR, point 2 on this slide is it evens out. It doesn't matter how fast your offhand is with Flametongue, because if it's slow, you get more Storm Strike out of it. If it's fast, you get more Flametongue out of it, which is beautiful because it doesn't matter what speed your offhand has to be. You don't have to worry about it with Wind Fury Flametongue. As long as your main hand is slow and has Wind Fury, your offhand can be any speed you want with Flametongue, and it'll produce near the same DPS. And I will show you data to corroborate this. I'm not just saying this, I actually tested this, and this is theory that's based upon work that's been done in the Classic Shaman Discord. Okay, the third point is mental quickness was buffed in patch 2.3 to provide more spell power from attack power, 30% of your current attack power. Since this was changed later in TBC, most Theorycraft kind of just shut Flametongue out the door. Wind Fury at this point was already established as the best weapon imbue for enhancement. However, because of this change, Flametongue gets pretty damn powerful. So it really depends on what you like, and I'll get to that later, and I'll show you the data to back that up. If you got 2 slow weapons, Wind Fury will do pretty damn well. However, if you don't have a slow weapon in your offhand, or you do have a slow weapon and you just like this better, it's pretty competitive with Wind Fury to use Wind Fury Flametongue. I know that's a lot. Maybe re-listen to the slide if you're lost, but essentially, Flametongue is speed agnostic, whereas Wind Fury is not. Your offhand has to be slow for it to work. Now I present the testing and findings of Wind Fury Flametongue comparisons to Wind Fury. I used ANOVAs, or analysis of variance, to do this analysis, and I did it for slow and fast one-handers. I did 20 kills per combination, average DPS per encounter. You can see the Google slides, I'll link them in the description if you want to see my actual inputs on these and how I calculated them. The first slide you'll see illustrates epic quality weapons. Season 1 Gladiator, 91 DPS weapons, 2.6 second axes for the slow tests, and a 1.8 second main hand and 1.6 second dagger used for the offhand for slow slow weapons. The second slide illustrates green quality level 70 weapons with 65 DPS, again with 2.6 second axes and 1.7 second daggers. So the combinations for both plots are Wind Fury with double slow, Wind Fury with slow main hand and fast offhand, Wind Fury with double fast, and then the same three combinations for Wind Fury and Flame Tongue. Let's first go over the test with 91 DPS weapons. So this is a box plot. If a letter is shared between plots, it means they're not different from each other statistically. And the alpha cutoff I used here is 0.05. It's a normal cutoff for most of these types of analyses. So the purple are Wind Fury, and then the first is slow, fast, double fast, and the orange, reddish box plots are Wind Fury, Flame Tongue, slow fast, and double fast. The first thing you'll notice right away with Wind Fury is if you incorporate any fast weapon, whether it's in an offhand or main hand or both, it reduces the DPS considerably and significantly so. And you'll notice a similar trend in Flame Tongue. Another thing you may realize is that Wind Fury slow and Wind Fury Flame Tongue slow or Wind Fury Flame Tongue slow fast have similar DPS statistically. There's no difference, which is very interesting. That's what the theory actually suggests, and I corroborate that with my testing. If you have two slow weapons, Wind Fury does the same amount of DPS statistically as Wind Fury Flame Tongue, as long as you have a slow main hand. However, if you have a fast main hand and fast offhand with Wind Fury Flame Tongue, the damage drops off. Wind Fury does not do well with fast weapons, as you can see. With Wind Fury fast, that damage is considerably lower. It's actually lower than anything else that I put on the plot. Another thing you may realize is that variability, especially with Wind Fury Flame Tongue with slow fast, is higher than Wind Fury. This is an interesting result, and this makes me think that my private server actually does code the 36% proc feature for Wind Fury. You shouldn't have more variability in Wind Fury Flame Tongue, considering your offhand produces the same amount of damage from the spell power portion, regardless of your weapon speed. I would expect more variability from double Wind Fury, but you actually see more variability from Wind Fury Flame Tongue overall. And my only explanation for this is that when you're using double Wind Fury, you have a higher proc chance of 36%, reducing the overall variability. Again, I didn't test this specifically, but it's something you can come out with from this data that could be a possible reason why you see such low variability with double Wind Fury. We move on to the second slide with the 65 DPS weapons. The same trends show up. The damage is obviously lower because we're using weapons of lower DPS, but the same patterns emerge. Wind Fury slow, Wind Fury Flame Tongue slow, and Wind Fury Flame Tongue slow fast have the same average overall DPS. While if you incorporate faster weapons in the offhand or main hand with Wind Fury, the damage drops off considerably, and we see a similar result if you use double fast with Wind Fury and Flame Tongue. Again, fast weapons with Wind Fury just doesn't work, and this data shows that and corroborates that. And more importantly, the loadouts, whether it's Wind Fury, Flame Tongue, do approximately the same amount of DPS statistically, as long as you're using Wind Fury with a slow main hand. We see that high amount of variance again in Flame Tongue, leading me to believe that the Wind Fury 36% proc chance feature is coded in the private server that I use, which is interesting because it's based upon what was found in original TBC, and it leads me to believe that this could be a feature we'll see in TBC Classic. Briefly, let's go over the summary points. I already said these, but let's just hit them home. Wind Fury slow, Wind Fury Flame Tongue slow, and Wind Fury Flame Tongue slow main hand, fast offhand have the highest DPS and are not significantly different from each other at an alpha threshold of 0.05. This means that Flame Tongue is speed agnostic when it's used in the offhand, and that Wind Fury only really works if you have two slow weapons. This will require further testing and raids to determine if there's a clear winner on official clients, of course. 2. Wind Fury Flame Tongue slow and Wind Fury Flame Tongue slow main hand, fast offhand show that offhand speed doesn't matter as long as a slow main hand with Wind Fury is used. Fancy way of saying Flame Tongue offhand is speed agnostic. This means that likely if you get a fast offhand weapon in a raid, you could use it with Flame Tongue without sacrificing significant DPS output. And that may be the case. You may come across a weapon that's an upgrade, but you don't want to use it because it's fast. If you're able to put it in your offhand, do that, use Flame Tongue, and you shouldn't suffer significantly DPS-wise. 3. Wind Fury fast is the lowest possible DPS, most of the time significantly so. Fast offhand weapons with Wind Fury have significant detrimental effects on DPS due to the Wind Fury proc stealing, as we talked about a few slides back. If you're stuck with two fast weapons, use Wind Fury Flame Tongue. However, this is not optimal. It will do more damage than double Wind Fury with two fast weapons. Because of this, it may require players to use weapons with less DPS or lower item level if it is slow, as the benefits of slow main hand outweigh the DPS increase that a faster one with a higher eye level has. I don't know where that breakpoint is, but it may be obvious. If you can't get a slow main hand hand, you may have to wait on an upgrade because you will suffer significantly in DPS if you put a fast main hand on using Wind Fury. 4. Wind Fury, at least with the parameters tested, doesn't outscale Wind Fury Flametongue. The reason I use two different weapons, one of a very low quality, 65 DPS, and one of them at much higher quality, 91 DPS, is to see if Wind Fury does outscale Wind Fury Flametongue due to weapon damage increases. I didn't see this, however, we could go higher, and 91 DPS is high, but there are weapons that have higher DPS, especially Season 3 and Sunwell type gear. So it may outscale, and this is something that you'll have to consider while going through TBC Classic, is Wind Fury has the potential to outscale Wind Fury Flametongue because of weapon DPS upgrades. However, attack power does also increase with upgrades as well, meaning you'll have more spell power due to mental quickness. So Flametongue also scales up with gear, but in a different way. 5. Wind Fury Flametongue is more variable than Wind Fury. Again, I'm not sure why this is. This could be due to sampling error, or it could be that the proc chance is higher with Wind Fury, 36%. Of course, the only way to test this is to do this again on the live client. So I'm sure you're wondering, what does Melderon mean by fast and slow? Is there a breakpoint to where you would go from Wind Fury Flametongue to Wind Fury, and vice versa? The good news is that in endgame TBC, weapons that fall within the middle category, which I consider 2 to 2.4 seconds, are extremely rare. This is because dual wielding classes want one or the other, and the game was itemized with that in mind. Finally, they kind of removed these weapons that are sitting in that middle ground that are really not good for anything, and that makes weapon choice really easy. However, if you do find yourself stuck with the potential upgrade that falls in the middle speed category, you can do one of two things. Just use Flametongue since it's speed agnostic, or if you're hellbent on Wind Fury, the breakpoint, due to some simming I did, is to be around 2.2 to 2.3 seconds. Around that offhand speed, the DPS of Wind Fury Flametongue starts to take over. So if you go faster than 2.2, 2.3-ish seconds, Wind Fury Flametongue takes over. If you go slower than 2.3 seconds, Wind Fury seems to do really well. So that's the speed I would use as a breakpoint, somewhere between 2.2, 2.3 seconds. Anything below that, go Wind Fury Flametongue. Anything above that, you could potentially do Wind Fury, or Wind Fury Flametongue, considering Flametongue is speed agnostic. I did some more testing concerning double imbues and two-handers. Now, as shown in the previous slides, Wind Fury with slow weapons and Wind Fury Flametongue with a slow main hand and any speed offhand will be the best options for PvE DPS. However, very early endgame, like just Sting 70, and leveling may lead to the idea that other combinations, especially double imbues, may be better. For instance, before spell power, via attack power, and weapon DPS scale much higher with endgame gear, it may be prudent to use more consistent DPS imbues, i.e. double Rockbiter or double Flametongue. For the sake of science, I tested all double imbues for several weapon speeds, and with a two-hander, as sometimes you may just have to go with what you have when you're leveling in early dungeons. The first slide is double slow with one-handed weapons, the second slide is double fast with one-handed weapons, and the third slide is with a two-hander. Same rules apply. We're going to be using ANOVAs to analyze these things, and this is for dual wielding with slow weapons, 2.6 second weapons at 65 DPS. As you can see, Flametongue is quantitatively lower than the rest of the imbues, but the averages are actually not different at an alpha threshold of 0.05. I didn't do as many tests with these because in my opinion these aren't as rigorous and they're not as important in my opinion than endgame PvE comparisons, but just so you know. With double fast weapons we see the same thing. Again, Flametongue is quantifiably lower, so is Frostbrand, but Rockbiter and Wind Fury seem to be a little bit higher, but again there's no statistical difference at a 0.05 alpha threshold. And we see the same thing with the two-hander. The magical imbues are lower than the physical imbues, but again they're not significantly different. So the summary here is there were no significant differences in DPS within speeds across imbues, single or double. However, Rockbiter and Wind Fury have the higher overall DPS potential in all comparisons, while double Flametongue and two-handed Flametongue are the lowest. Again, these are not significant, however. Because of this, while leveling and during very early endgame, fresh 70s, I would do the following imbue setups in no particular order and see what you like the best. Judging what we saw from the hybrid imbues and the other testing, I think Rockbiter main hand and Flametongue offhand will do very well, considering a lot of leveling offhands are fast in TBC, so this will be a great choice. A second possible imbue would be Wind Fury main hand, Flametongue offhand for the same reasons as above. You can also go double Wind Fury as long as your weapons are both slow, 2.4 seconds or above in my opinion, and of course you can go double Rockbiter because that should be totally speed agnostic. In my opinion, if I was leveling Enhancement, I would go Rockbiter main hand, Flametongue offhand, or Wind Fury main hand, Flametongue offhand. The only thing that sucks about Wind Fury is that it doesn't happen often, and it seems to always never happen when you need it to when you're leveling. I'm a huge proponent of Rockbiter while leveling, so I would probably go Rockbiter main hand, Flametongue offhand, but if you like Wind Fury, Fury, go Wind Fury. For a two-hander, in my opinion, there's only two options, Wind Fury or Rockbiter. They'll produce the highest consistent DPS, and Rockbiter, of course, is more consistent, Wind Fury is more variable, and if PvP is a worry, of course Wind Fury is the way to go, because time of engagement is much more important in PvP skirmishes. Overall, dual wielding should produce the higher DPS output with enhancement talents, because it's just built to increase dual wielding potential. So I would shy away from two-handers unless the upgrade is significant. If it's much more DPS than what you're using on your main hand and offhand, I would consider using a two-hander while leveling. Let's move into something different. Another significant part of your DPS profile as an Enhancement Shaman are shocks. The optimal rotation for shocks is to start with a Flame Shock. After the cooldown elapses, you cast Earth Shock and then refresh Flame Shock on the third cooldown. This allows Flame Shock to fulfill its entire 12-second duration. Now, if you have Reverberation, of course, this will decrease your shock cooldown time. That gets into another argument whether what the best talent loadout is for enhancement, whether you're an Resto subspec or an Elemental subspec. Even if that's the case, you still want to do the same rotation. Flame, Earth, Flame, Flame, Earth, Flame. On the surface, it may seem that Earth Shock usage every cooldown provides superior DPS due to the Storm Strike buff. However, Earth Shock does not benefit from as many buffs as Flame Shock, and it's a binary spell. Furthermore, it's very high probability that an Elemental Shaman will steal one or both of your Storm Strike buffs on the boss or the target, because they'll be constantly spamming lightning spells. So if you can time a Storm Strike and then Earth Shock, that's great, but it doesn't happen all the time, and you may lose out on that buff a lot. The fact that Earth Shock's a binary spell means that Earth Shock can either be fully resisted or provide full damage. It can't do anything in between. Flame Shock, on the other hand, can be partially resisted on either the initial damage or the dot portion, still providing DPS and getting more out of spell hit. Furthermore, Flame Shock benefits from Curse of Elements, which is an 8% increase, Malediction, which is a 3% increase, Improved Scorch, which is a 15% increase, and Misery, which is a 5% increase. While Earth Shock only benefits from Misery, and the Storm Strike buff, which I said before, is not reliable. If we have example with 2500 attack power, which is 750 spell power, thanks to mental quickness, and assuming we have all of the buffs provided above. An Earth Shock spam every 6 seconds will produce 207.9 DPS, whereas an Earth Shock Flame Shock cycle will provide 249.1 DPS. Therefore, assuming we have all the buffs, the Earth Shock Flame Shock cycle will produce more DPS on average, and this is assuming no crits, obviously. So, this math shows you that it's superior to use Flame Shock, Earth Shock, coupled with the fact that you can't rely on the Storm Strike buff. I heavily recommend using this rotation to maximize your DPS for your shocks. Let's get a better understanding of how Storm Strike works. When dual wielding, Storm Strike manhand and offhand attacks don't actually land at the same time. They may appear that they do, but the game handles them differently. It actually first checks if the main hand attack is fully mitigated, a parry, a miss, or a dodge. If it is, then the offhand attack actually won't even happen, leading to 0 total damage. However, if the main hand attack isn't fully mitigated, the offhand attack will occur, but it isn't guaranteed to land, and it can still be parried, dodged, or missed. So your first attack, your main hand attack, has to hit in order for the offhand attack to even attempt to hit. Just something to realize about Storm Strike. You'll see 0 damage come out. You're like, wait a second, did my offhand even try? No, it didn't if your main hand didn't hit. Now, considering strategic timing of Storm Strike, you may think to yourself, well, I'm going to use Storm Strike at a certain time to maximize Wind Fury uptime or Earth Shock. In TBC, Storm Strike Wind Fury proc should not reset the swing timer as they did in Classic Vanilla. If you know, you time a Storm Strike after a main hand attack, because if a Wind Fury proc does happen, it resets the swing timer, and you want to minimize any DPS loss due to a swing timer reset. However, that isn't the case in TBC and shouldn't be the case in TBC. Of course, I will test this. Therefore, there is no need to wait for a non-Storm Strike Wind Fury proc to cast Storm Strike. Because of this, it's imperative to use Storm Strike on cooldown, as delaying a Storm Strike for a Wind Fury ICD reset could lead to DPS loss in most cases, as it's very hard to gauge when a Wind Fury will happen after that ICD. It could happen immediately, and now you're on ICD again, you're like, okay, I'll wait for the next one. It's a DPS loss, so just use it off cooldown. Now it's time to talk about equivalency points as far as enhancement is concerned to compare potential upgrades. Some upgrades are clear, as they provide more of all relevant stats that you need. However, some pieces that are of similar item level are harder to compare, as they have a representation of different stats than your current piece. In these circumstances, an equivalency point system is used. This is kind of like stat weighting with a little bit more thought involved, and I'll explain what that is. So this table represents all of the relevant stats you want to acquire as an enhancement shaman. The columns after the stat represent phases of TBC Classic: Tier 4, Tier 5, Tier 6, and then finally Sunwell. And the numbers in there correspond to the stat weights per se of each of these things. For instance, attack power is always weighted as 1, strength is always rated 2, and then the other stats kind of move and fluctuate depending on what tier you're in. If you see parenthetical values, like for strength you see 2 and then 2.2, those correspond to the values if you have Blessing of Kings, which you should have in all raid settings, because it increases stats by 10% and therefore affects the stat weights. And then the green table is weapon DPS. This is not attack power, it's the DPS of the weapon itself. One main hand DPS, as you can see, is worth 9 equivalency points, whereas one offhand DPS is worth 3.7. So how do you use these equivalency points when you're actually comparing pieces of gear? On this slide we have 2 comparisons. So if we compare these pieces of gear, assuming we're in tier 5 and we have Blessing of Kings, the Veilstalker Girdle has 27 agility, which we multiply by 2, because that's the EP weight for agility, which equals 54 EP. Haste is multiplied by 1.4 for a total of 50.4 EP, and then attack power is multiplied by 1. If we add all those things together, we get a total equivalency points of 180.4. The Girdle of Title Strength just has strength and crit rating as our important stats. Of course, intellect and stamina are important, but they just come with gear. It's not something we really want to calculate equivalency points wise. If we add all those things together, it's only 143 EP. So in this case, the Veilstalker Girdle is a better upgrade, and that you should replace the Girdle of Title Call with. Or if you have access to both, you pick the Veilstalker Girdle. Now let's do weapons. These are both one-hand weapons, which means they can be equipped in the main hand or the offhand, and they're both slow. So they're good additions if you're doing Wind Fury, or Wind Fury Flame Tongue. The first is the Merciless Gladiator's Cleaver. In the main hand, it gets 9 equivalency points. In the offhand, it gets 3.7, and then we add up all the other relevant stats. So if you're wielding this as a main hand weapon, it gets a total of 962.4 EP, whereas if it's an offhand, it gets 442.75 EP. Netherbane gets 871 EP as a main hand and 357 EP as an offhand. Adding all the other relevant stats, we can see that this weapon as an offhand is better than using Merciless Gladiator's Cleaver as an offhand. So the optimal setup would be to use Merciless Gladiator's Cleaver in the main hand, and then Netherbane in the offhand. That's how you would compare weapons using the EP system. These are just 2 possible examples, but as you can see, the system can be used with anything, and it's very, very powerful. The only thing this doesn't model is weapon speed, but now that you know that weapon speed is very important when using Wind Fury, you can weight that yourself. And if you're using Flame Tongue, of course, your offhand can be any speed you want. So add this into this EP system as a way to compare relevant upgrades. And just so you know, this EP system was developed by the folks over at Elitist Jerks. And after talking to an expert on enhancement DPS of the Classic Shaman Discord, he said this system is a very good system to use for TBC Classic. Let's now get into totem twisting. I covered this already in Advanced Shaman Guide Part 1 from Vanilla Classic, but if you did not watch that video, I'm going to explain how to totem twist. The reason you can do this is because Wind Fury Totem provides a 10-second buff that applies to your melee in your melee group, your allies, that gives them the chance to proc Wind Fury, 20% chance on a main hand or 2-hand swing. The buff is applied and then gets reapplied every 5 seconds. So if the totem's gone, your allies still have the buff that allows them to proc Wind Fury. This allows you to give them another bonus from another air totem while still providing them Wind Fury. In this image, the green arrow going from left to right represents encounter time that's actually going on in the encounter you're in. The white bars above the arrow represent 1-second time intervals. Now, this is kind of out of date because the totem global cooldown is now 1 second, not 1.5 seconds. But to be honest, I was lazy and didn't want to draw up another image because I've used this image so many times by now. So ignore the yellow bars. Just totally ignore them. At the start of an encounter, you can drop a Wind Fury totem, providing that buff for your allies. After 1 second, your global cooldown will elapse, allowing you to drop a second totem. After that 1 second, you're going to drop Grace of Air totem, providing that additional agility to your allies, and that totem's benefit will last until you drop a new Wind Fury totem. So you get 9 seconds of a Grace of Air buff. I know it says 8.5 there, but remember, the GCD for a totem has been reduced to 1 second. So you're providing both Wind Fury for 10 seconds and the Grace of Air buff for 9 seconds during this 10-second time window. At the end of the first 10-second time window, you're going to drop another Wind Fury totem, giving them the Wind Fury buff again. After the 1 second GCD, you're going to drop another Grace of Air, giving them 9 seconds of additional agility, and then you rinse and repeat every 10 seconds. So every 10 seconds, you're dropping a Wind Fury totem, and then you're dropping a Grace of Air totem, dropping a Wind Fury totem, dropping a Grace of Air totem, and you're going to do that for the entire encounter. Therefore, giving your party members both Wind Fury and Grace of Air. Now, Grace of Air Air won't be up for the entire duration. Again, there's always a 1 second window where you don't have Grace of Air in each 10-second interval, but still, a 90% uptime of Grace of Air will provide a substantial agility bonus to your melee counterparts in your raid. Spend some time looking at this slide. I realize that I just said it's out of date, but the fact that you're able to provide both benefits to your raid is huge. I realize it's very intensive considering you have to worry about your own rotation, but if you're able to do this, it's very, very beneficial, and there are weak lures and add-ons that are developed specifically for this, so you'll never miss a reset, and you'll still be able to maximize your rotation with some practice. And remember, Grace of Air doesn't only benefit them, it benefits you. 77 agility is a hefty amount of crit, so another reason to do this. So just how beneficial is totem twisting? As I said, Grace of Air Totem rank 3 provides 77 agility. That's 3.08% crit for warriors, paladins, druids, and yourself. It's 1.93% crit for rogues and hunters, and provides melee attack power of 77 for rogues and druids, and 154 range attack power for hunters. Now, you would normally want to have hunters in your group as an enhancement shaman, but you may, depending on how many you run per raid. But the melee group, as you can see, benefits substantially from this buff, and so do you. You can also twist Tranquil Air Totem, which is another air totem instead of Grace of Air, as long as the tank isn't in your group. Never do this if the tank's in your group, because now you're giving the tank's threat, for a 20% reduction in threat. Now, this stacks with Blessing of Salvation for an overall threat reduction of 44%. So this can stack with the Paladin Blessing of Salvation. Now, obviously, you would only do this if there was some kind of issue with threat. You would not use this otherwise. It won't be used as often as Grace of Air, just so you know you have the option to do that, just as long as the tank isn't in your group. Let's now talk about threat as an enhancement shaman. There are way more threat-sensitive encounters and fights and moments in TBC compared to Vanilla Classic. Because of this, you may notice you are creeping dangerously close to the tank on threat. If this occurs, the first step is to remove shocks from your rotation. This is because the majority of your DPS comes from white hits and Storm Strike. Shocks are a significant portion, but they aren't the majority. And because of spirit weapons, these attacks produce less threat. Your white attacks and Storm Strike produce 30% less threat than your shocks do. Something to keep in mind. This leads to more bang for the buck, if you will. The next step will be stop DPS completely. However, this leads to shamanistic rage falling off. And this may work great because if you're high on threat, maybe also the melee are too, so you may want shamanistic rage to fall off. But if for some reason you don't, you can have level 1 white weapons or like skinning knives in your inventory to keep this buff up without significantly increasing your threat. Now, I realize this is pretty try-hard, but it wouldn't be an advanced shaman guide without this type of information. So note, you can do this, but be careful, you can still pull threat this way. In most circumstances, no threat's better than some threat, but for some reason, if you're just threat capping and no one else is, like the melee aren't, you can still provide them the buff for shamanistic rage using very, very low item level weapons like skinning knives or level 1 white quality weapons. So you may want to keep these weapons in your inventory just in case this does happen. Finally, let's talk about talents. Now, I said in the beginning of this guide, way back, that we won't be talking about talents. We won't be doing talent loadout stuff. I halfway lied. The reason I'm bringing this up is because there is some debate over the Resto subspec versus the Elemental subspec. You put the same talents in the enhancement tree in both of these. However, the Elemental subspec increases more of your shock and totem damage. The downside of this is that it likely won't scale as well as the Resto subspec due to the hit you get from Nature's Guidance. And this spec also may be more limited in threat-sensitive fights, considering that your spell power does more damage and therefore more threat. The Resto subspec, on the other hand, most shaman will use this build as you get 3% extra hit from Resto, increasing the white damage from auto attacks, but they're pretty comparable. Until we have access to an official client and can actually look at DPS parses, I won't be able to tell you which one of these is better. I can tell you that most shaman definitely go Resto subspec because of that 3% hit. It just scales better. Hit is always good for white attacks, whereas Elemental subspec has the potential for more burst DPS due to the increases of your spell damage, including your fire totems and your shocks, and also reduces the shock cooldown, which over time could potentially lead to higher DPS. TLDR for now, until I have some better information, pick which one you think is best, pick the one you like better. I potentially would go Resto subspec as it's safer and they will scale better with weapon damage. Moving on to the Elemental Theorycraft overview. I told you there was a lot in Enhancement, but don't worry, Elemental and Restoration are a bit more streamlined. The primary PvE DPS contribution of Elemental Shaman comes from lightning spells, Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning. There are 3 possible rotations which depend upon fight length and available haste, which will be discussed in the next couple slides. Shocks, primarily Flame Shock, as it is the highest single DPS shock, are only used usually when moving. This is because shocks are expensive, and most mechanics in TBC will require you to be at max range, which is outside of the 20-yard shock limitation. Maintaining high crit, water shield, and mana spring totem is incredibly important for mana conservation. I can't stress this enough. Make sure these things are always up. Because of Elemental's high hit and crit from talents, itemization is very straightforward. Elemental Shaman come out of the gate with a lot of hit and a lot of spell crit from talents in Elemental and Restoration. Outside of rotation and mana management, 100% uptime of Totem of Wrath and Wrath of Air Totem is required. Again, you are a DPS, however, you are a hybrid buffer. That's a very, very important part of your job, is to keep your totem uptime 100% as you provide very, very important benefits to the rest of your raid and your party. As I alluded to in the last slide, there are 3 possible rotations for Elemental Shaman. The first is the Lightning Bolt spam, and this rotation is good when fights are exceptionally long, longer than 5 minutes. Of course, this will depend on your mana regen and your mana pool itself, so this time may shift depending on the player you are, what consumables you have at your availability, but essentially the Lightning Bolt spam just spams max rank Lightning Bolt the entire time. This works because Lightning Bolt has lower mana cost than Chain Lightning, and can be spammed for longer periods of time due to that fact. So we sacrifice the higher DPS of Chain Lightning, which comes primarily from its shorter cast time, but remember, Chain Lightning also has a higher top end than Lightning Bolt before 1189 spell power. At that point, there's a break point where Lightning Bolt has a higher top end, higher possible damage output, but since Chain Lightning is always going to be a quicker spell, its DPS will always be higher than Lightning Bolt. This is a suboptimal rotation as far as maximum damage output is concerned. But again, you may have to use this considering how long the fight is and how much mana you have at your disposal. The second rotation is 3 Lightning Bolts, 1 Chain Lightning. Since Chain Lightning has a 6-second cooldown and Lightning Bolt Talented will have a 2-second cast time, you can neatly fit 3 Lightning Bolts, each Chain Lightning cooldown, and then cast Chain Lightning. Do this over and over again. 3 Lightning Bolts, 1 Chain Lightning. 3 Lightning Bolts, 1 Chain Lightning. This is better for fights that are shorter than 5 minutes. Again, that 5 minutes cutoff point is arbitrary, really. It depends on how many crits you get, the consumables at your disposal, and any mana regen you make it during the encounter. So essentially, this is the shorter fight rotation. And the third and final rotation is 4 Lightning Bolts, 1 Chain Lightning. And you're thinking, Melderon, you just said Chain Lightning has a 6-second cooldown. How can I fit 4 Lightning Bolts in for 1 Chain Lightning? That's because this is reliant on haste. The more haste you have, the more neatly 4 Lightning Bolts fits to 1 Chain Lightning. Now, you'll need a lot of haste to fit 4 Lightning Bolts neatly before your Chain Lightning comes off cooldown, but as long as you have enough haste, which is approximately 10%, which is 158 haste rating, it's more optimal to let the 4th Lightning Bolt go off before you cast Chain Lightning. However, this gets a little bit more complicated. The amount of haste needed to make this rotation optimal really depends on how much spell power you have, and we'll get into that in the next slide. So just to reiterate, the amount of haste needed to make 4 Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning optimal has nothing to do with that you fit 4 Lightning Bolts total before Chain Lightning comes off cooldown. You may have to clip the Chain Lightning cooldown with a 4th Lightning Bolt, but it's still optimal DPS wise because of the amount of spell power you have. Okay, here's a graph from Elitist Jerks showing how much haste you actually need to make the 4 Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning rotation optimal. Now I want you to ignore the red line. That doesn't really matter anymore because in 2.4 haste was reconfigured, so the 2.3 haste model will most likely not be in TBC Classic, so ignore that red line. The 2 lines I want you to look at are normal and the blue line, which is tier 6 4-piece set bonus. So what you'll notice right away, the amount of haste to make 4 Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning optimal depends on how much spell power you have. The more spell power you have, the less haste you'll need to make this work, and that's because Lightning Bolt has a higher spell coefficient than Chain Lightning. You get more out of your bonus spell power from letting that 4 Lightning Bolt finish and clipping that Chain Lightning cooldown. That seems counterintuitive, but DPS metrics corroborate this theory. So the green line, if you're at 0 spell power, you would need 12.5% haste to make the 4 Lightning Bolt Chain Lightning optimal. However, if you have 2500 spell power, you'll need about 5% haste. It's a big difference. So I want you to study that curve, and then you'll have a general idea of how much you'll need to make that rotation optimal, and you will see an uptick in DPS if you change your rotation from 3 Lightning Bolt to 4 Lightning Bolt using this graph. Now the reason why the blue is a little bit lower is because tier 6 4-piece increases the damage dealt by your Lightning Bolt by an additional 5%. Therefore, Lightning Bolt does more damage. You'll need less haste to make this rotation optimal, considering again, it's worth more to finish that 4th Lightning Bolt cast with more spell power than to begin that Chain Lightning cast. So again, TLDR, use this graph as a guideline to determine how much haste you need to switch from 3 Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning to 4 Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning. Let's go over elemental stat priority. It's actually pretty simplistic. You come out of the gate with a whopping 12% hit and 13% crit thanks to your talents and Totem of Wrath. You actually come out with 13% hit if you're a Journey elemental shaman. That's huge, and it leaves a lot of room on your stat priority. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to complete your hit rating. You only need to get to 16%. So if you're an Orc, Troll, or Tauren, you need 4% from gear, which is 51 hit rating, and if you're Journey, you only need 3%. Next, you're going to get crit until you reach about 40%. That's including your talents, but unbuffed. So 40% with your talents, with Totem of Wrath, that's where you want to get unbuffed. Now this also works amazing with the Lightning Capacitor Trinket. What this trinket does is you gain electrical charge when you cause a damaging spell to critically strike. When you reach 3 charges, all those charges will release, firing a lightning bolt that does damage, and I'm sure scales with spell power as well. Because Elemental Shaman casts so frequently, and because you have such a high crit rating, because remember, crit is your mana conservation stat, thanks to Elemental Focus, this trinket is really good for Elemental Shaman. But again, the reason why you're getting so much crit is because you want to proc Elemental Focus as much as possible, and the only way to do that is with crit, and that'll be your Mana Sustain along with Water Shield and Mana Spring Totem. The next thing you're going to want to go for is Spell Power. After that, you're going to want to get Haste until 4 Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning is optimal. Remember, the more spell power you have, the less haste you'll need to make this work, and since haste just comes on some upgrades and can be gemmed as well in tier 6, the more spell power you have, the less haste you'll need to get that 4 Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning to be optimal. And remember to reference that chart in the previous slide if you don't know how much haste you need. And again, if a fight's really long and you don't have the mana sustain for Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning or 3 Lightning Bolt, 1 Chain Lightning, you can also just spam Lightning Bolt the entire encounter. Now, I previously alluded to this in the slide we just talked about, but why so much crit for an Elemental Shaman? Along with being a mana conservation stat, Elemental Shaman also do double crit damage thanks to Elemental Fury. In the game, all other casters, unless they have a talent like Elemental Fury, do 50% bonus damage. But now with Elemental Fury, crits do double damage. So another reason why crit's very important. But again, as I stated previously, it's because of Elemental Focus. The more crit you have, the more mana you'll get back. So crit benefits us 2 very different ways. It increases DPS and it increases mana conservation. Because of this, getting crit is very important as an Elemental Shaman. As long as you have enough hit, start building your crit package so you can last fights and do a lot more damage. Now, it's good to spend some time go over Lightning Overload and how it works. This is essentially the Elemental Shaman's Wind Fury. 20% chance to cast a similar half damage spell at no additional threat cost when you're casting Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning. And again, the beautiful thing about this talent is that it's completely set and forget. It's 100% passive. You don't have to do anything with it, and it's a 10% increase to damage. 20% chance divided by 2, which is half damage, leads to an overall damage increase of 10%. However, understanding how this talent works with your Elemental Focus is important. The game should allow Lightning Overload crits to proc and refresh Elemental Focus. If you're casting Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning, and one of your Lightning Overload extra spells crits, it should proc Elemental Focus or refresh it if it's just at 1 charge. Concerning the Theorycraft that I read online from Letus Jerks and from other sources, that is how it should work. Unfortunately, on my server, it did not work this way. It's a little buggy, but I'm expecting it to work this way in TBC Classic. Secondarily, crits from this ability should also proc any kind of crit-based trinket, like the Lightning Capacitor, which you talked about in a couple of slides back. So it has no mana cost to you, it produces no threat, but it has additional benefits in that it could proc any type of trinket that has a crit-based proc, and it also should proc and refresh Elemental Focus, which is your clear casting state. I went over this in the spell coefficient section, and even previously before that, in the changes to old talents and new talents section. However, it's good to spend some time on this again if you didn't listen to those sections. Lightning Bolt in TBC, the base cast time of Lightning Bolt is reduced from 3 seconds to 2.5 seconds, and Chain Lightning is reduced from 2.5 to 2 seconds. It has nothing to do with talents, they just decreased the cast times of these 2 spells. Furthermore, the talent Lightning Mastery, instead of offering 0.2 second reduction per rank, now offers a 0.1 second reduction per rank, leading to the same talented cast times as in Vanilla Classic of 2 seconds for Lightning Bolt and 1.5 seconds for Chain Lightning, if you have 5 out of 5 in this talent. So you get the same end product with the talent, but since the base cast times are lower, the spell coefficients are lower, leading to a nerf of these 2 abilities. Using our knowledge of spell coefficients, then the Lightning Bolt coefficient should be reduced from 86%, which is 3 divided by 3.5, to 71%, which is 2.5 divided by 3.5. And furthermore, similarly, Chain Lightning coefficient should now be reduced from 71% to 57%. However, this is not the case because Blizzard increased these base coefficients to 80% for Lightning Bolt, which is still a nerf, and 64% for Chain Lightning. Now, this is an increase of approximately 13% from the theoretical coefficients that they should be, 71 for Lightning lightning bolt and 57 for chain lightning. So it's a 13% bonus, essentially, that they gave to these spells because I guess they felt bad because they reduced the cast time so much. Now this still results in an overall nerf of damage of 7% for lightning bolt and approximately 10% for chain lightning compared to classic vanilla. I don't know why this is, but thank God for lightning overload because that produces a 10% buff overall over time. So essentially, thanks to lightning overload, the nerf is kind of removed. Now it would have been nice to have a 10% bonus on top of the older cast times, but that's not the case. Can't give you a reason why they did this. I don't know why they reduced the cast times. I thought lightning bolt and chain lightning had a pretty good spell coefficient, and I don't think we topped GPS charts even with the increase in the spell coefficients, but again, that's Blizzard's decision. But just so you know, that's what you're coming to expect. You're only going to get 80% of your spell power to lightning bolt and 64% to chain lightning. Let's talk about elemental mastery. I'm sure if you played Vanilla Classic and you PvP'd at all as a shaman, you probably tried out elemental, and you tried out elemental mastery and got the chain lightning shock combo crit batch, which is just amazing. You see a picture in the bottom right here of Dremlock producing 8,000 damage there using this combo. In patch 2.3.0, unfortunately, chain lightning shock combo batches were nerfed and are no longer possible. I know, rip, right? Hopefully they keep fresh vanilla servers going so we can go back to this time and experience this whenever we want. But because of this nerf, this isn't a combo you'll be using in raids. Like I said before, shocking will only be used during movement phases. You really don't want to get too close to bosses in TBC because mechanics keep range targets at max range. That's in the design that way. So instead, I would use elemental mastery on cooldown when your chain lightning is off cooldown for a free guaranteed chain lightning crit. That's always nice. So always spend EM on chain lightning if you can. Otherwise, use it on trash when it's off cooldown with a shock, because the shock may still crit, you just can't get 2 guaranteed crits. So it still may be a good idea to use this on trash. Time to move on to Restoration Theorycraft. Restoration Shaman are one of the most efficient and sought after healers in endgame PvE. This is primarily due to the power and throughput potential of Chain Heal, but of course, your totems and bloodlust are very, very nice. And also the unique nature of Earth Shield as a set and forget tank heal. Success as a Restoration Shaman comes from 1. Knowing what rank and type of heal to use in any situation, and balancing your itemization for both throughput and mana conservation. In addition to this guide, I highly suggest reading Egregious's Resto Shaman Guide on Classic WoW Live and watching the video we made last week. The link will be in the description below. This will go over just the Theorycraft portions of that video, but there are other aspects I would definitely explore if you want to play Restoration Shaman in TBC Classic for endgame. Also, Egregious has created the TBC Resto calculator to determine which heal is best when you look at your stat itemization and the amount of available spell power you have. A link to that calculator will also be in the description below. An important thing to consider when healing as Restoration Shaman is the relationship between the two stats, Intellect and MP5. Both of these provide mana, but they do so in opposite ways. Intellect represents your maximum mana pool at the start of the encounter, i.e. how much mana you have when you're finished drinking and you start a boss encounter. It also increases your crit and healing spell power if you have Nature's Blessing. So that's an added benefit to Intellect. MP5, on the other hand, generates mana at a rate of 1 Intellect's worth of mana, which is 15 mana, every 75 seconds. Therefore, the worth of MP5 increases with fight length. I like to say that MP5 matures like a fine wine over time. In other words, if we ignore int-based crit and spell power, 1 MP5 will supersede 1 Intellect after 75 seconds have elapsed. However, it's important to have both of these stats as more Intellect leads to a few different things. 1, using your mana consumables sooner and getting more potion and rune. Yes, demonic runes are still used in TBC Classic. Cooldowns per encounter, and that allows you to use your consumables more efficiently and optimize your consumable rotation. If you healed it all in Classic Vanilla, you know that you should use your consumables as early as possible so you can get more potion or rune cooldowns as the fight goes on. Also, Intellect increases your possible mana deficit. By mana deficit, meaning how much room or mana you have to cap your mana, allowing MP5 to work for longer. So the more mana deficit you have, the more space MP5 can occupy as an encounter moves on. The TLDR is Intellect and MP5, although they are opposite in effect, can work together, and having both of them is very, very important in TBC Classic. And this comes down to budgeting each stat using fight length as a variable. The longer the fight, the more MP5 you want. However, as more gear becomes available, spell power and greater intellect let you budget less MP5. And this is because, like I said in the downranking section, the more spell power you have, the more effective your downranking can become. Therefore, less mana per second that is required to allow you to keep your raid alive. So MP5 is very, very important in early TBC Classic when you don't have a lot of spell power and intellect to keep you chugging along in longer encounters. The point of this slide is to understand the difference between these two stats, but how they work together to achieve a common goal, to provide you mana for an encounter, and how spell power can affect the ratio of these two stats in your stat priorities. This leads us to talking about a very related set of terms, static versus effective mana. Static mana is front-loaded, and this is the mana from intellect. So static mana can be seen as synonymous with intellect and how much mana you have at the start of an encounter, while effective mana is backloaded and is more synonymous with MP5, but not just MP5. And this is the mana that you'll have access to over the course of the encounter. Again, intellect is front-loaded and effective mana is backloaded. So what are the sources of this backloaded mana? We already talked about one, and that's MP5. MP5 regenerates mana every 5 seconds no matter what. It's not conditional on anything, therefore it's a significant part of your backloaded mana pool. But there are other aspects of this mana pool. Consumables like potions and runes, mana tide totem, spells from other classes like Innervate or the mana regeneration from Shadow Priests, spirit-based 5-second rule ticks, which isn't very common in Shaman because we don't get any added benefit from spirit, and you won't stop casting for 5 seconds very often in an encounter, but if you do, you'll get some spirit-based mana regen. Secondly is critical strike, and this isn't directly effective mana, but it's indirect effective mana because the more crits you have, the less healing you'll need to do, because one, crits provide more healing because there's a bonus of 50%, and it procs Ancestral Fortitude, meaning that the raiders who have Ancestral Fortitude will take less melee damage, therefore possibly requiring less healing. And finally, spell power. As I said, the more spell power you have, the more effective downranking you can do, therefore saving your mana and increasing your effective mana pool over time. And these are a lot of variables, obviously, so effective mana pool is sometimes very, very challenging to model, but you can estimate its maximum value using encounter time. That's one of the only things you really can model. Each time you go into a raid, each week, you're going to record your fights and see how long they are. Therefore, you can kind of look back and say, well, okay, am I using my consumables properly? Do I need more MP5? Do I need more spell power? Encounter length is one of the only variables that you can actually know, and therefore will aid you in budgeting your stats in longer fights and when you're building out your effective mana pool. If you want to learn more about these terms, I actually made a video called Mana Management and Optimization. Again, it's for classic vanilla, but a lot of these concepts I talk about in that video, and I think it'll help you understanding this slide and healing in general. Now let's talk about haste. We haven't really talked about haste yet as far as Resto Shaman are concerned, but it's a very, very important stat, especially in tier 6 when the haste gems come out and you'll have more access to haste. The goal for Resto Shaman is to reduce the cast of Chain Heal as low as possible, since it's your most common heal used and because of the incredibly high spell coefficient thanks to improved Chain Heal and Purification. You also get even more on some set bonuses too. You can get up to near 100% for Chain Heal. Therefore, haste is very, very important. On this slide are values of haste in order to reduce the cast time of Chain Heal from 2.5 seconds to the cast times that are shown below. 2.4, 2.3, 2.1, etc. all the way down. It should be very, very hard to get Chain Heal down to 1.8 seconds with 613 haste, which is 39.9% haste. But again, reducing the cast time of Chain Heal should be a priority when you get into endgame because of how much damage comes out in later tiers, especially tier 6 and Sunwell. Because of the ability to reduce Chain Heal so low, it's not uncommon for Resto Shamans to go all haste gems in tier 6. And Egregious goes over why in the Resto Shaman PvE guide, which I really suggest you to watch. But the reason I put this slide in here is to know that haste is a very, very important stat for you as a Resto Shaman, and it should be a very high priority stat, especially to reduce the cast time of Chain Heal. As with Enhancement, we also have Restoration Equivalency points thanks to Egregious and Elitist Jerks. If you didn't watch the Enhancement section, equivalency points are ways to compare potential upgrades. Some upgrades are clear as they provide more or all of the relevant stats that you need. However, some pieces that are of similar item level are harder to compare as they have representation of different stats than your current piece. These are where EPs are used. It's very, very simple and straightforward to use. As you can see, Egregious separates EPs into early game, which is around T4, and late game, which is tier 6 and beyond, and gives numbers for intellect, healing, MP5, crit rating, stamina, and haste rating. Before we get to the comparisons, I want to point out how these EPs shift from early game to late game. As you can see, healing gets more potent in late game because it allows more effective downranking. MP5 reduces reduces from 5 to 2, and this goes what we were talking about before in the previous slides, how MP5 is very, very impactful in early game, but starts to lose its effect in late game as you have access to more healing power and can downrank more effectively. Okay, let's get to the comparisons. So if we use the late game EP system, we can compare first 2 chest pieces and then we'll do 2 rings. So the 2 chest pieces are the Firecrest Breastplate and the Harbor of Empires Champion. The Firecrest has 34 intellect, which you multiply by 0.8, which is the late game equivalency metric for intellect, to get 27.2 EP. We do the same thing for crit rating. Healing spell power has a 1.2 modifier, bringing it up to 97.2 equivalency points, and 10 MP5 has a 2x modifier for 20 equivalency points. Therefore, the total of Firecrest Breastplate is 171.6 EP. We do the same thing for the Hallmark of Empire's Champion, which has more MP5, more healing spell power, more intellect, so obviously this is going to be a clear upgrade, at 263.2 EP. But one thing to notice outside of those other stats is that the Hallmark of Empire's Champion has haste rating, which has a EP modifier of 2, while the Firecrest Breastplate has crit rating, which only has an EP modifier of 0.8. That's because haste is much more impactful for Resto Shaman than crit, which is another reason why the Hallmark of Empire's Champion is a clear upgrade. Now let's look at the rings. The Ring of Flowing Light has 23 crit rating. We multiply that by 0.8 to get 18.4 EP and 75 healing spell power, which we multiply by 1.2 for 90 EP. Adding those together, we get 108.4 EP. Now interestingly, the Jade Ring of Ever Living has 68 healing spell power, which we multiply by 1.2 for 81.6 EP, and 12 MP5, which we multiply by 2 for 24 EP. But since the Ring of Flowing Light has almost doubled the crit as compared to MP5 and has a substantially more healing spell power, the Ring of Flowing Light actually is a bigger upgrade. So here we can see, even though MP5 is weighted higher than crit, because the Ring of Flowing Light has more healing spell power and a substantial amount of crit, it actually wins out with the EP system. So this slide shows you how you can compare pieces of gear using the EP system, and how it's important not just to look at if a stat is on a piece of gear, but to actually compare 2 pieces using a system, so you can identify the most impactful upgrade. Next, it's important to go over each healing spell and their primary usage. You have a lot of spells at your disposal, and of course Chain Heal may make up 85 to 90% of all your heals, but that doesn't mean that other heals and other effects aren't important. So Chain Heal is of course your bread and butter, and most of your healing will come from this spell. This is because of its large coefficient, which is bumped up by Purification and Improved Chain Heal. If you actually add in all 3 bounces, if you have Purification and Improved Chain Heal, you get 165 of your total bonus healing power. As far as use, you want to use this whenever multiple targets are taking damage that happen to be near each other, and this happens a lot more than you think. Obviously, the melee group is a prime example of where you would direct your chain heals bouncing off the tank or other melee, but in many encounters in TBC Classic, range casters and hunters will be grouped up as well, making chain heal very, very effective in those circumstances. Healing Wave is your single target tank heal that applies Healing Way if it's talented. You want to use rank 1 whenever you have a chance to keep up Healing Way, because rank 1 still stacks Healing Way, and it still gives you a chance to proc Ancestral Fortitude at a very, very low cast time. So it's still prudent to have rank 1 in your bars, but essentially what you're going to be using this for is single target tank healing. This Healing Wave is more of an emergency heal, has a very low coefficient, and should only be used when raid members are about to die and Nature Swiftness is not available, because if it is available, you should use Nature Swiftness with Healing Wave for more healing with less time. You can also use Lesser Healing Wave when chain heal is ineffective due to people's positioning, or when the tank is taking large amounts of damage and Inspiration and or Ancestral Fortitude is not active on the target. Remember, its Inspiration is the same as Ancestral Fortitude, which is put on by priests. Earth Shield your Leave and Forget tank hot. Always keep it up if you're assigned to do so. Also can be used on other raiders outside of tanks for niche purposes. It also provides additional threat to tanks and is considered healing that they provide to themselves, not healing that you provide to them. Warriors and Feral Druids get a 0.7475 threat per healing because of the abilities they have to increase their threat generation. Paladins also receive threat from the mana they get from it via Spiritual Attunement at a rate of 0.5 threat per mana. Water Shield must be active at all times and refresh while moving or whenever you have a free GCD available. It is very, very important this stays up as long as it possibly can, because it's 50 free MP5 and 200 mana if you get hit and it procs. Also, Water Shield can proc Insightful Earthstorm Diamond, which we'll talk about in a few slides. Finally is Nature Swiftness. This is a cooldown that allows you to have an instant cast heal. You should use it with max rank 12 Healing Wave in emergency situations when someone's about to die, i.e. the tank has a large damage spike and brings them below 30% health. Pop this with max rank Healing Wave to get them back into a safe health area. Also, you can use it on CD to correct any healing deficit you may see in the raid. Either way, you're effectively healing your group. Taking what we know now about those heals, it's time to talk about what are the ideal ranks you should have hotkeys for each of your healing spells on your bar. For chain heal, you should have rank 1 for small trickling healing, baseline healing that's needed during raid encounters during low to average damage. Next, you should have a mid rank of chain heal, which is rank 3 in the beginning of TBC Classic, but as you get more spell power and are able to downrank more effectively, you can use rank 4 in this position. And then finally, max rank 5 for severe or high AoE damage. For healing wave, you should have rank 1 for healing way and proccing Ancestral Fortitude. It's a very, very short cast time and should have this on your bars no matter what. Next is rank 7 for low to moderate healing. You can upgrade to rank 8 once you have more spell power and then select, as it will do more healing and you'll have more mana to support a higher ranked spell. Rank 10 should be used for moderate to high damage and should be cast on your tank if they're receiving substantial damage. And finally, rank 12, which should be paired with Nature Swiftness used for emergency situations. You should not go anywhere below rank 5 for healing wave, because essentially at that point it's a waste of time, and even though it may be more mana efficient, the HPS or the healing per second is much lower than what you would need in most situations. For lesser healing waves, you have rank 5 for using on casters and rank 7 for using on higher HP targets like tanks and melee. If you want to look through this more, definitely check out the TBC Resto Shaman throughput and efficiency calculator that Egregious has made to look at the HPME and HPS of each of these spells when you increase your spell power. The link to that will be in the description below. Now let's talk about Insightful Earthstorm Diamond. There are 2 potential meta gems you can get as Resto Shaman in TBC Classic, and one of them is the Insightful Earthstorm Diamond, and this one is primarily thought of to be the optimal option because it gives mana back when it procs. Now, the MP5 value depends on the cast time of the spell you're using to potentially proc it. Insightful Earthstorm Diamond procs off any cast, which includes heals, totems, DPS abilities, and even Water Shield. Totems and Water Shield are instant cast abilities, and so are shocks, so those abilities are the best to use since they don't have a cast time associated. Water Shield would be the best out of those 3 because Water Shield is something you're going to keep refreshing over the course of combat that has no mana cost. And why would a Resto Shaman be casting damaging spells or refresh totems before they actually need to be refreshed? So Water Shield refreshes are a free, instant way to proc Insightful Earthstorm Diamond. When it does proc, you receive 300 mana. The proc itself has a 15-second internal cooldown, so of course this can't happen more than once in a 15-second window. So as a result, the gem has a 3.85% chance to proc if you're approaching from a 2.5 second cast. 2.5 seconds is chain heal. That's going to be the most common spell you're going to be casting. So over the course of combat, if you're constantly casting chain heal, you have a 3.85% chance to proc Insightful Earthstorm Diamond. Now, haste will reduce the proc rate, and with more than 200 spell haste, the proc rate decreases to around 3.5%. That's just because you're casting more spells in a unit time, therefore the proc rate will reduce, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. So it'll still happen 3.5% of the time if you're casting with 200 or so haste. But remember, since Water Shield's an instant cast, that's even more potential chances for it to proc, and it's optimal for it to proc on Water Shield considering it costs you nothing. The proc chance may decrease the faster your spells are, however the MP5 generation increases the faster your spells are. If you're looking to see how much MP5 you would get from a certain cast time, you can look at the table to the right. So if you can get your chain heal down to 2 seconds, you can increase the MP5 from Insightful Earthstorm Diamond from 23.1 to 28.9. And yet another reason why you should decrease the cast time of chain heal and use Water Shield whenever you can. Alright, time to move on from the Theorycraft section and again to the end of the guide. Thank you for sticking around this long if you have. Let's go over optimal raid composition. This raid comp I have on the right is not the end all be all, it's just the optimal in terms of where Shaman should be placed. However, it will be close to most raid compositions you see in TBC Classic. You will see most comps look like this. Maybe you'll have one more Hunter and one less Warlock. Maybe you'll have an Arcane Mage instead of a Fire Mage. Things like that. You may not have a Balanced Druid, but this is essentially what your groups are going to look like. Also, you can move the Shadow Priest from Group 5 to Group 3 if you run an Arcane Mage. There's a lot of things you can do with this, obviously. But I want you to look at where the Shamans are placed. Group 1 is an Enhancement Shaman, where you will be providing Wind Fury and Strength of Earth Totem while attempting to twist Grace of Air Totem or Tranquil Air Totem if threat is an issue. Groups 2 and 5 are Restoration Shaman, providing Mana Spring Totem and Mana Tide Totem. In Group 5, you're obviously going to be using Wrath of Air Totem for yourself and the other healers, while in Group 2, you could use Wrath of Air, of course, to boost your healing potential, but you can also use Grace of Air to increase the damage of all of the people in that group, the Feral Druid Tank and the 3 Hunters. It may be good for Group 2 Shaman to have an enhancement off-spec at the ready and sub in another raid healer elsewhere elsewhere. Therefore, you'd only have 1 Restoration Shaman, 2 Enhancement, 2 Elemental, and you'd bring in another Priest or Druid to help raid heal. Again, this could be fight specific, doesn't have to be every fight. I'm just pointing out that this doesn't have to be a Resto Shaman in all encounters. It could be the same Shaman with an Enhancement off spec to provide Grace of Air Totem. And finally, groups 3 and 4 are the Elemental Shaman, which will be in the caster groups, providing Totem of Wrath, Wrath of Air, and Mana Spring Totem. This is 2 Resto, 2 Elemental, 1 Enhancement. You could run 2 Enhancement, 2 Elemental, 1 Resto, or you can even run 1 less Elemental and have 2 Restoration and 2 Enhancement. It really doesn't matter, just as long as you put the right Shaman in the right place. That's the most important thing. I'm not here to tell you the meta and what the most optimal raid composition is going to be, but I just want to make sure you know where Shaman should be in the raid and make sure they're providing as much benefit and utility as possible to the other people in their party. Now let's go over Bloodlust and Heroism. I have the same picture here because we're going to be talking about Bloodlust and Heroism in respect to the groups you have. Now, if you weren't listening to the beginning of the presentation, Bloodlust is a party-wide buff in TBC with a 10-minute cooldown given only to the Shaman that's using it, not the whole raid. Therefore, you can cycle Shaman in and out of groups to provide Bloodlust to groups that need it the most. High DPS groups, essentially, or you can Bloodlust your entire raid. There are 3 general strategies you can come up with to rotate Shaman, and this is all fight and guild specific. I'm not telling you that you should use one strategy in a certain fight or use a certain strategy and if you're another guild. No, you should come up with those rules yourself, but there are 3 possible options you can think of. One strategy is to buff the entire raid during a short burst window. Some fights in TBC have very short windows where you can create a significant burst of DPS. In that situation, it's better to buff your entire raid at once, allowing the most DPS possible. Another is to rotate Bloodlust into the same group 5 times. Usually this is a Hunter or Warlock group, providing the most DPS over time. If there's no short burst DPS window, if you can DPS during the entire encounter, it may be more beneficial to give Bloodlust to your highest DPS group, as long as threat isn't an issue, obviously. And the last is to find a mix of the two. It may be prudent to buff the melee twice, and maybe the Warlock group 3 times, or vice versa. It really depends on the fight and the type of guild you are, and what your raid leader wants. I'm not here to tell you what the best is, I'm just here to tell you that you don't have to buff your entire raid all at once. TBC is very unique in the fact that you can come up with strategies in Theorycraft for using Bloodlust in each encounter in an optimal way, in a way that's best for your group or best to get the content down. Let's not talk about threat in TBC. Even though both factions now have access to Paladins, and therefore Blessing of Salvation, which is 30% threat reduction, threat produced by DPS and healers is more of a consideration in TBC compared to vanilla because, 1, warrior tanks will likely be deep prot and not dual wield fury. This is an overall reduction in warrior threat. If you don't know, bosses hit a lot harder in TBC versus Classic, therefore the fury prot meta will likely not be viable in TBC Classic unless we're missing something, but private servers are buffed. It may be true that fury prot could work in some fights in TBC Classic, but for the most part I suspect all warriors to be deep prot, leading to lower threat overall than you're used to from vanilla Classic. Feral Druids and Paladins are not affected by this specific fact, however many fights may require a warrior tank, but overall there'll be a lot less threat coming from tanks because of point 2. The lack of world buffs. Now this significantly will decrease tank threat and DPS threat, creating a vacuum of possible threat, which is primarily going to go to healers and high DPS classes. So it's very important for healers and high DPS classes to watch their threat. 3, rosters are smaller, which reduces the number of available tanks to likely only 3, which means there are less possible tanks to pick up threat. In vanilla Classic, there's like 4 to 5 tanks that are tanking trash. Some fights require 3 tanks, some fights require 8, 4 horsemen of course. That's very rare, but there's more total tanks in vanilla Classic with a 40-man roster compared to 25-man. And this will increase overall effective healing output as less healers are required to do more, increasing healer threat. This will increase the chances of DPSers and healers to be next on the threat table over a tank, especially if off tanks are tanking totally separate targets. TLDR, I bring this slide up because you have to be much more mindful of the threat you're producing in TBC Classic by either limiting DPS or even healing if it's possible without putting your raid in danger. Be very, very wary of initial threat on pulls and always watch your threat meters. And threat reducing talents have been added to Elemental and Enhancement to counteract any threat you may produce in fights. Healing Grace is still in the Restoration tree, and that's something you may want to pick up if you're a Restoration Shaman. So even with the 30% reduction from Blessing of Salvation and the threat reducing talents that are available in all 3 specs to Shaman, threat is still an issue in TBC, so be very, very mindful of the threat you're producing and how you can mitigate or alleviate threat. Now let's go over leveling your Shaman in TBC Classic. Whether you're leveling fresh from level 1 or leveling from level 60, there are certain pointers that we can talk about to improve your leveling efficiency and progress. Shaman work confident levels in vanilla Classic Classic. They weren't great, but they weren't bad either. There are some obvious improvements to the leveling that comes in TBC Classic. This graph to the right represents leveling speed by spec. And this was a video done before Vanilla Classic that I did on the beta to show the speed of each spec. I have a one-hander plus shield enhancement in red, a two-handed enhancement in green, and an elemental shaman in blue. The time that it takes in hours to level for elemental is much higher until around level 40, where elemental gets those really impactful talents and then they start to speed up. Two-handed enhancement was a close second, one-handed plus shield enhancement was the slowest. Now one-handed plus shield enhancement kind of goes out the wayside in TBC Classic because of dual wielding, but as you can see, elemental's faster than enhancement, getting up to 60. However, this came with the trade-off of drinking more, have a longer downtime, and higher cost due to the amount of water you have to buy. So if you want to watch that video, the link is in the description, but again, this is TBC Classic, so I suspect things to change actually pretty significantly between these two specs, between elemental and enhancement. What is leveling going to look like in TBC Classic? Leveling speed overall has been increased due to buffs to both enhancement and elemental trees. We have things like Totem of Wrath, Unrelenting Storm, Lightning Overload, Wrath of Air Totem, Dual Wield, Shamanistic Rage, Unleashed Rage, Mental Quickness. All these things are drastic increases to the damage output of these two specs. I suspect pre-40 though, the landscape will look very similar to Classic. I think enhancement's 100% the way to go before level 40 if you're worried about speed and effectiveness, considering elemental needs a lot of those core talents from the bottom of the talent tree to make them really effective and fast. However, 40 plus, I don't think elemental itself will have a significant edge over enhancement. If it does, it'll be very slight. This is due to enhancement doing way more damage and becoming much more mana efficient than they were in Vanilla Classic. Being able to dual wield, have reduced mana cost of your shocks, having mental quickness, having unleashed rage, having water shield, all of these things are going to increase the mana efficiency of enhancement just as much as it does elemental. I think it's going to be very, very close level 40 plus. I will test this once TBC beta or live comes out. The point of this guide is to do a lot of the groundwork, the testing of spell coefficients, a lot of the theorycraft, whereas the next guide will be more tailored toward just checking the math that I've done on this, making sure it's right, and then spending some time testing the leveling experience and seeing how fast it is to get to 70. There are two theories concerning which spec to go, in my opinion, though, if you're looking for an answer now. One is level the spec you will not play at endgame to experience the other side of it, keeping any relevant upgrades for your endgame spec. I'm going elemental in TBC Classic, so maybe I'll choose the level enhancement to see what that's like and just store any relevant upgrades for elemental as I level. That's one option. And then theory two is level the same spec you'll play at endgame to learn the ropes if you're not comfortable with that spec, or just because you really love that spec. That's another reason, right? You may say, oh, I'm going elemental endgame. I couldn't see myself playing enhancement at all. I don't want to play that spec. That's fine. That's obviously the spec you love, so you should play it. But if you're new to Shaman, I suggest leveling in the spec you're going to be playing endgame so you get to learn how it's done. Obviously, resto leveling is extremely slow unless you're leveling in dungeons. And if you plan on leveling in dungeons all the way up, resto is a perfectly viable spec to level in TBC Classic, but I would not recommend leveling resto if you're leveling out into the world, because your leveling experience will be so much slower than enhancement and elemental, considering all the DPS bonuses they've gotten along the way. Next, let's go over the Aldor or the Scryers. These are two factions you come across in Shatrath City in TBC Classic, and you get to side with either of them. You can do both. You can drop reputation with one and then go with the other, but in most scenarios, most people are going to pick one and stick with it because it takes a lot of time to get this reputation up. Whether you pick the Aldor or the Scryers depends on what type of shoulder enchants you're going to get, access to certain profession-linked items and recipes, and gear, which is very low item level gear, so you'll out-level this very, very quickly. It's more for the profession-linked items and the shoulder enchants. To be perfectly honest, without going into the nitty-gritty, which I will go over the next slide, these factions are relatively balanced. The gear and item upgrades, as I said, will be out-phased rather quickly. So I will use the EP scores and the stat priorities from the previous Theorycraft sections to determine which faction is better for the long term for the shoulder enchants, and if that isn't a big deal for you, go with the one that provides the best profession-linked rewards for you, because the gear, unless you're a rogue, really isn't a big deal. So use the professions and the shoulder enchants to aid your decision. Before we get to the next slide on shoulder enchants, let's talk about the profession recipes that are available to each. And the biggest ones to talk about are Elixir of Major Firepower, which is a alchemy recipe which is only available from the Scryer. So if you're an alchemist, you might want to get this if you're a completionist like me. And the only other really big difference is that you get Golden Spell Thread, which is a tailoring enchant, if you will. It's added to your pants from the Aldor, which provides a healing enchant, and the Runic Spell Thread for tailors if you want a spell damage enchant from the Scryers. So this may put you in a certain direction, but let's get into the shoulder enchants. For restoration, using the early endgame EP system provided by Egregious and Latest Jerks, the Scryers provide more MP5. The Aldor EP for the shoulder enchants 38, while the Scryer EP is 42. However, using the late game EP system, the Aldor is better as MP5 loses value. In my opinion, if you don't want to switch, go with the Aldor as they will be more relevant in harder raids, with the Aldor EP at 29.6 and the Scryers at 26.4. For Elemental, the Scryers offer more crit, and I would personally side with them. Also, the plus hit trinket is nice early on to make up for that 4%, 3% if you're Janae, you need to get hit capped. The Aldor are also a perfectly fine choice, especially if you don't need the extra crit. For enhancement using the EP system, the Scryers provide more crit, which is always weighted higher than attack power in a slightly less than 2-to-1 ratio. On the surface it appears the Scryers is better, but if you do the actual math using 1.97 for the crit EP, which is the highest EP across all phases provided by Latest Jerks, the Aldors eke out slightly over Scryers due to the higher attack power values on these enchants. Aldor with a 49.7 and the Scryers with a 49.55. Because it's so close, I'd go with whatever faction aid your professions and early endgame itemization. And really this goes with all of them. There's really none of these that are really super clear. Even Elemental, yes, the Scryers offer more crit, but what if you're at that crit cap? What if late game you're already at that 40% and you really don't need any more crit? Well then, therefore the Aldor would be better. It's really a toss-up, to be perfectly honest. Restoration, I think I would definitely go with the Aldor because as the game progresses you want less MP5, but for enhancement and elemental it's kind of up in the air. And remember, these are the only shoulder enchants that are available in TBC unless you want to go back to the Naxxramas and get the Saffron enchants, which are actually better than these. So if you have a chance to get back into Naxxramas, you should do that. But if you aren't, again, go with the one that seems the best for you and aligns with your profession. That's the only advice I can really give. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about user interface. Just want to say, to improve your experience in TBC Classic, I highly recommend to make sure your UI is as simplistic, open, and accommodating as possible. There's a lot more mechanics in TBC compared to Vanilla Classic. Having an optimal view of the entire screen and all possible mechanics is very good regardless of what spec you're playing on your Shaman. Here's a picture of Egregious's UI playing Elemental. As you can see, his action bar is reduced at the bottom of the screen. He has a central location for his raid frames. He has all relevant information, his health, his mana, his totem uptime, the target's debuffs, all in the very center of the screen. Everything else is reduced. DPS, threat meters, and chat window, the system bar, everything is reduced and moved to the side. And I highly recommend using a UI like this to make your life just easier. And of course, this type of user interface can be accommodated by add-ons and weak auras. Some suggestions that I would say are for like either Vanilla Classic or TBC are the following add-ons. Clear, concise raid frames. That could be like Luna, that could be Grid, that could be the standard Blizzard if you know how to use it and put it the right size and right location on your screen. Totem timers are huge. Knowing what totems you have down, how long they have before they elapse, this is required for Shaman. Weapon rebuff reminder. Weapon buffs have been increased from 5 to 30 minutes, so you won't be hearing these dings as often, but I have a thing, even in Vanilla Classic, even as Restoration, that dings me whenever I don't have a weapon imbue on. I highly recommend that. HPS and DPS add-on. This is not for bragging rights, this is for just seeing what's been happening in the raid. Why is one healer's HPS so much higher than another? Is the positioning wrong? Why is one DPS so low? Does he not have enchants or consumes? These are the things that you can come up with using HPS and DPS add-on. Sure, yeah, you can brag and that's a fun part of it, but there's much more you can learn from that information. Deadly boss mods are bigwigs. This is required for any raiding guild or environment, knowing what the mechanics are, the timers of those mechanics, where they're going to be, who they're going to target, very important. A threat add-on, as I said, in TBC, threat is much more of a factor to consider, and knowing how much threat you have compared to the tank is very important. Item rack, there are gear loadouts and pieces and trinkets, other pieces of gear that are better in some encounters over another. Item rack allows you to switch gear out very quickly. I highly suggest item rack. Click or mouse over macros because this is more for Restoration Shaman, being able to just mouse over a unit frame and healing is faster than clicking. This is something that you can do in Classic WoW and Classic TBC. You don't even need to use click. You can actually integrate mouse over macros with a standard macro system. A swing timer for enhancement, even though you don't really need to time a Storm Strike for a swing timer reset in TBC Classic as you do in Vanilla Classic, knowing when your weapons will hit is very, very important, especially for PvP. So I definitely suggest if you're doing enhancement, use a swing timer. Finally, a Wind Fury totem buff tracker. This is not knowing when your Wind Fury totem is up and down, it's knowing that people in your group have Wind Fury buff on their weapon. Now, there's a weak aura for this, it's called Wind Fury now. This requires your other players to have it as well as you, but it's very, very good. We actually require it in our raid to make sure the shaman know that the melee in their group are in range of the Wind Fury totem and have the buff. Very, very important if you're an enhancement shaman. In addition to these, TBC brings some new mechanics to the table that should be tracked with an add-on or weak aura. One of them is water shield uptime. Making sure the water shield is up at all times is huge, and that mana regen should never be wasted, so make sure you track that with an add-on or weak aura. A cooldown reminder is also very, very nice, like Tell Me When or Pulse, one of those things where it shows you when Storm Strike, Shocks, Elemental Mastery, Nature Swiftness, Bloodlust or Heroism, or Mana Tide Totem are off cooldown. I highly recommend having a reminder to tell you when these cooldowns are up so you can use them when you need it. A Wind Fury ICD timer, you can't circumvent the ICD, but it's good to know that if Storm Strike coming off cooldown also times with an ICD reset, that's really nice to know, and knowing that you can potentially get a Wind Fury proc from Storm Strike would be very, very beneficial. The next is a Totem Twisting timer or weak aura that tells you when to pop Wind Fury down, when to pop Grace of Air. These already exist for Vanilla Classic. It's basically a simplistic weak aura that tells you to put down Wind Fury Totem, lets you know how much time you have until the next Wind Fury Totem, so you can put Grace of Air in between those. I highly recommend this if you're a Totem Twisting Enhancement Shaman. And the last one I would recommend for Restoration is an Earth Shield uptime tracker. It's good to know when Earth Shield falls off your tank, especially if you're healing another target. Having a weak aura and an add-on to let you know to rebuff Earth Shield on the primary tank would be very, very beneficial for a Restoration Shaman. Ladies and gentlemen, we did it. 3 hours plus of Advanced Shaman in TBC Classic. This is by far the longest guide I've ever made. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Apologies for its length, but there's a lot to go over. Use the timestamps and annotations to navigate the guide if you're looking for a specific thing. Real quick, let's talk about other Shaman resources that you can find more information. Obviously, I have a lot of videos. I've referenced a lot of them in this guide itself. If you're looking for a specific guide, I put the link to that in the description below. If you're looking for another Shaman guide, I put my Shaman playlist link in the description below. So definitely check those out, because if you have a question, 99% chance I answered it somewhere else in some other video. And I'm sorry that I can't tell you exactly which video that is, but I don't know what your question is. So if you have a specific question, you can leave me a comment on YouTube, or even better, you can find me in the Classic Shaman Discord. It's a big Discord. We have a lot of people in there, a lot of great knowledgeable people, including Egregious, including Hitbutton, including some amazing Shaman trainers. I'm in there as well. You can bother me whenever you want. The link's in the description. Once you click that link, you'll see the README channel, and then you'll see a reaction post. Just react to that post with whichever content you'd like to see: Classic Vanilla, Classic TBC, Wrath of the Lich King, or a combination of all three, and you'll be able to see all the relevant channels, find me in there, and ask me a question. Finally, Classic WoW Live is a site that I helped create that has a bunch of guides and other types of material on it that you can access. Definitely check that out. That's where you can find the Egregious Resto Shaman PvE guide, the written guide, as well as many other TBC Classic and Vanilla Classic guides and content. And finally, remember, this is part 1. When the beta or an official client comes out, I will be making another Shaman guide called Advanced Shaman Guide Part 2 for TBC Classic that will go over anything I couldn't answer in this and corroborate any of the questions I had from this guide. Thank you so much again for watching this video. Keep on keybinding and grinding, and peace, my Shaman brothers and sisters. May the ancestors be with you. Take it easy.